presentations, confirmation of minutes, move the minutes for the Planning Committee of 3rd of August 2022. I'll move them as a seconder. Councillor Lorver, all those in favour? That's carried unanimous, thank you. Any elected member communications? Okay, so we'll move on to the reports and recommendations. There are people to speak on every item, and there are only 3 items on the DA register, so I'll take them in order.
Mr. Chairman, just given that each one is going to take a considerable period of time, perhaps you might like to invite someone to speak on a matter if they wish to leave and can't stay.
Yep, do that. So we have an opportunity, since the meeting is broadcast, if anybody, I have no idea how long the meeting will last. It could be up to 2 or 3 hours. But if you want to speak on an item and leave, and then you can watch the proceedings at home, you've got the opportunity to do so now. Is there anybody in that category? Okay. Or you can, if you need to go outside at any point, you can go outside, and you'll see when the previous item finishes that time to come back in. Okay, so item 1 is the Henderson Street car park, Spicer site, restaurant, hotel, and reception centre. It's a JDAP application. I'll just explain what that means for people who don't realise. JDAP is the Joint Development Assessment Panel. It's a state government body comprising of 3 nominees of the Minister for Planning and 2 nominees of the Council. The Council is required to make a recommendation to that body, and that body makes the determination. Their meetings are open to the public, but you do have to ask first. You can't just turn up. So we don't have a date for that meeting at this stage for this item. So if you register an interest with the planning officers, they'll notify you when that is. They have been held over Zoom, and I think we're going back to face-to-face meetings now. But we're not 100% sure of that, but we will press for a face-to-face meeting if we can. Okay, so I'll just explain how this works. The officer's recommendation is on page 10, and that recommends that the council, which is this committee, supports the RAR drawn up by the officers. If the committee chooses not to agree with that recommendation, then the committee's recommendation will replace that part of the agenda on page 10. The committee's recommendation will become the RAR, the Responsible Authority Report, and the officers' RAR, yes, it's different, checked it today, and then the officers, I'll ask the acting director to confirm, but we did go through all this today, it's a different format, and then the officers' RAR will follow on from the councillor's recommendation. Can you just confirm that's correct? This is the first time it's been this way, and it's a little bit confusing.
Yes, Chair. The Department of Planning updated their template relatively recently to confirm that the responsible authority recommendation, if it goes through council or a planning committee like it is tonight, that is the initial recommendation, and then there is a separate section where the officer's recommendation will sit. Ultimately, I think DAP were just getting a few too many reports that it wasn't clear what the officer's recommendation was versus what council's recommendation was. So it's really just setting out whose recommendation is who.
Just to be clear, this applies to all 3 items tonight. Previously, the committee weren't allowed to change the RAR. Now we are. We were previously only allowed to comment on it. Now and in future, we are allowed to change it, in which case the changed RAR will become the substantive one, and the officers' one will become the secondary one. I apologise for that complexity, but that's we haven't had a large JDAP item for a while. Okay, so I'll move the officer's recommendation, which is for approval. Is there a seconder? Councillor Graham. Anybody wish to speak? Oh, sorry, public comment. Who have we got to speak on this? Okay. So we'll take the people against the officer's recommendation first and give the applicants an opportunity to respond. The only person I've got against the officer's recommendation is John Dowson. Is there anybody else just before we go? If we do miss anybody during that, just shout out. So, Mr. Dowson, you have 3 minutes. what you say will be part of the live stream and will be recorded. People can hear what you say, but they can't see your face. 3 minutes, thanks.
Mr. Chairman, before the 3 minutes starts, can I just confirm that each councillor has a copy of what I handed in tonight? That is a copy of Jeremy Dawkins's email from today and also an executive summary. Has everyone got those two? Thank you very much. Okay. The reason I'm here tonight is the Fremantle Society and others have spent weeks looking at this, a very major, serious and important application. And we feel that things have been let down very badly by the DAC, the Design Advisory Committee. It seems that each time they get an application, they go through it and look for good things that are there, and then they make recommendations of some things that can be improved. But at the end of the day, they're not standing up for what we think is the quality of the city. And you've only just got to look around you to see what DAC have approved in the last 10 years. Now, I want to start with Mr. Dawkins's policy. This is his policy for when he was Director of Planning in 1987. The Spicer Site policy seems to have totally disappeared. And Jeremy has written from Sydney, where he lives. He's written a letter which I've copied to you today, and I just want to highlight what he says, that whether the issue of whether or not this has status, it still has validity as in terms of the ideas of the policy. The fact that council might have lost it is perhaps unfortunate, but it seems to have disappeared. And his comment at the end there is, in advising the planning committee, the most important thing to say is that you have the power and the duty to not only administer any binding rules, but to achieve the best outcome in relation to the city as a whole. So that was him this morning from Sydney. He's so concerned about what's happening in Fremantle, he's actually going to fly back, which I think will be good. I'm going to finish with the second document, that's the executive summary. But I want to just read something that Jeremy Dawkins wrote in an essay last week about Fremantle. He was talking about Andrew Forrest's entry into Fremantle and knocking down the old limestone wall. And his comment is, this seems to define the owner's attitude to the city. It's there to be exploited. Ignore impacts on others. Ignore long-term consequences. Ignore the rights and values of neighbours and the users of the city centre. Ignore what happens to the city if developers exploit it in this way. Just build to the max. It'll pay big returns in the short term. Now, of course, Mr. Dawkins and others have also made submissions, and we have sent those to you. So you've got a copy of submissions from a wide range of planning experts. Very briefly, touching on the Urbus Report, which is what the developer has presented to you, just touching on that very briefly. It was certainly unfortunate that in 1852, well, according to their document, 1852, they also say 1862, but it's very unfortunate that that wall was demolished. It's going to be given to a Noongar artist and paid to provide an Aboriginal view of colonial history. Now, one of the key things about the report after that bad start is the total ignoring of the former existence of the two-storey Brockhoff building that used to be on that site. This is what used to be on that site, and that's totally ignored. And what the developers are doing is saying that because there was a four-storey building, Spicer site, that this gives precedent for some big oversized building. That's part of their argument that they're putting forward. And we would just like to point out that this is actually just as relevant. The two-storey building that was on that site for decades and decades. Also in the Urbus Report, which is...
Can I ask you to draw to a close, please? I've given you quite a lot more than 3 minutes.
Already?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, hell. Okay. Can I wrap up with... It's taken
no,
4
don't. I'll
weeks
give
to
you
get
another
to this.
minute or two. You are representing a few people, but
Okay,
don't
sorry,
settle it.
we are. I'm trying to represent a whole range of people. So we'll leave out the Urbus report and what it does and doesn't address, and go to the executive summary, which is basically commentary from the former chair of WAPC, Jeremy Dawkins, from the former city architect, Agnieszka Kira, Sasha Ivanovic, who was on the DAC committee, Carl Payne, local architect, and the Fremantle Society. We hope that you've had time to read these documents that we have sent. They've been on the front page of the newspaper. The issue was so serious that as we and everybody in this group that's presented these documents tonight agree that if the proposed height and bulk is allowed to be built, it will lead by precedent to the destruction of the historic heart of Fremantle, which is a place of natural, national, and international significance. You can see from the next item, Mr. Jones, Councillor Jones, where the proponent is arguing precedent for St. Pat's. You can see that once you allow a 6-storey building on this site, you're going to have to allow 6 stories all up and down South Terrace. We ask that you come up with your an alternative recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, just any questions of the speaker from the committee? Thank you. I've got 2 people wishing to speak in favour of the officer's recommendation. Do you want any particular order? I've got Megan Gammon and Tim Dawkins. Megan Gammon, thank you. Got 3 minutes. We'll be a little bit generous with the 3 minutes. It's a big application.
Thank you very much. Good evening, committee members and council staff. Megan Gammon from Urbus, so we're the planners representing 5A on this proposal. We're thrilled to reach this step of the process. The design review and planning process to date has been overwhelmingly positive, and that was reflected well in the officer's report. In the interest of time tonight, I'll speak to the overall merit of the proposal and the public parking element, and my colleague Tim Dawkins will speak to the alternative recommendation and the bulk and scale. The Spices Australia building, constructed in the late 1800s, as you all know, was an icon within the Fremantle landscape. While regrettably demolished in the 70s, the significance and prominence of the former building and its relationship to the broader city centre has not been forgotten, and it's been a key driver for this new development. Designed by William Smart of Smart Design Studio, the development will deliver a contemporary and sustainable boutique hotel, as well as an artisanal hospitality offering to guests and the broader public. It will deliver a new pedestrian laneway to the south and active interface to Paddy Troy Mall, William and Henderson Street. It'll breathe new life into a site that's been a highly underutilised car park for so long. The team has undertaken a highly collaborative approach to this project, again as reflected in the officer report. This includes early and ongoing engagement with officers, and as well as multiple 4 design review processes, receiving overwhelmingly positive feedback. One of the most positive that I've been involved in. 5A has further been proactive in addressing heritage matters, including the heritage limestone wall, which has been talked about tonight. 5A has recently carefully dismantled this in line with its previous approval, and it will store and reuse this as part of an interpretive public art piece as part of the site's redevelopment. It is also investigating how to celebrate a historical automotive sign from the 60s, which was uncovered from the dismantling a couple of days ago. So they're very committed to this public art piece. While outside the scope of this application, 5A has articulated a desire to pedestrianise Henderson Street, and when we did a briefing to elected members quite a few months ago, we went into a little bit of detail on this. This will increase safety and amenity, provide stronger linkages with the Waters cottages, and contribute to broader linkages within the city centre. So in this regard, Urbus and 5A have prepared a concept which we've presented to council staff and are continuing discussions involving its implementation. While we are satisfied with the majority of the conditions, we do wish to address condition 11 regarding the restriction of public parking. So as you all know, there will be 92 public parking bays on site. The proposed development seeks to significantly reduce the amount of public parking and provide 8 hotel staff bays and 40 public parking bays, so 48 in total within a concealed basement accessed by Paddy Troy Mall. As elected members can appreciate, the demand for parking for hotel guests is limited. It's in a city centre environment where a lot of people will arrive at the hotel by Uber, car share, or public transport. So while the remaining 40 parking bays are proposed for public purposes, it is anticipated that these will deliver a direct service for hotel guests who may choose to park during their stay. They'll also provide bays for visitors to the other uses on site, like the bar and restaurant, as well as nearby developments such as waters. This will ensure safe and convenient parking, particularly at nighttime periods. If these bays were to be allocated for the exclusive use by the hotel, so all 48, given the expected low utilisation by guests, it would be likely that many of these bays would remain vacant. So I guess it's considering the overall efficiency and use of these bays, and it provides a broader opportunity for the public to access. I also draw reference to the public submissions, and there were a few comments regarding concerns taking away all the public parking. So I guess retaining a portion, which is less than 50% than is provided now, it does respond to those concerns that have been raised. So on this basis, we seek elected member support to retain the allocation of public parking that's proposed. So I thank you for your time this evening, and again, officers, for the collaborative process. If suitable, in terms of questions, I wouldn't mind my colleague Tim Dawkins speaking on the bulk and scale component first, and then if that's suitable, we can answer questions collectively, but that's up to you. Thank you.
I'll just ask a question of the officers just on the issue of parking. Condition 11 on page 14 ends with the statement, all on-site parking shall remain allocated for the use of on-site tenancies only, unless otherwise approved by the City of Fremantle. Would that otherwise approved be another DA, or would that be a CEO's discretion? Can you just clarify that?
If it was for another land use, then yes, it would need another DA, unless it was a permitted use. But at present, public car parking is a discretionary land use.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
Tim Dawkins.
Good evening, elected members. My name is Tim Dawkins from Urbus. As Megan has outlined, we're extremely pleased to be assisting in the repair of this important portion of the city. We are passionate about Fremantle and are passionate about continuing to improve the place. We've been working on this project for the past 18 months, working closely with the city to figure out how to resolve the site. Urbus and the project architects have presented to the city's Design Advisory Committee on 4 occasions. And whilst co-design would be an inaccurate adjective, the design process has been highly collaborative and iterative, one of the best I've experienced. The design has responded after each meeting to refine the built form response, addressing items like setback, height, materiality, and relationship to key vistas and pedestrian desire lines. Ultimately, what this has led to is overwhelming support of the Design Advisory Committee with an endorsement of the built form and expressly the resolution of the bulk and scale. Again, I've experienced few occasions where the design review have been so supportive. It's important to note that the city's internal heritage referral, as well as the State Heritage Office, have documented their support of the resolution and the relationship to the Waters cottages in the broader heritage context. Pardon me. The development is approximately 30 centimetres above the height guidelines for Henderson Street. The building then steps up in the manner which ensures that no additional shadow falls on Henderson Street or the terraces or the Waters cottages. And they're in the pack attached to the agenda item. Additionally, additional height above the level above the Henderson Street edge is not only perceived by pedestrians within Henderson Street, it is a pedestrian street that is so important, and that is what we're trying to achieve. The so-called Spices site policy, as discussed by an earlier deputation, has no status. The building heights for the site have been established via Amendment 49, which identified opportunities to increase building height for 12 sites which could accommodate additional building heights whilst being respectful to the heritage context. This design has responded to that decision of council to adjust the heights for this site. In summary, we urge the elected members to endorse the officer recommendation in favour of the proposed alternative recommendation to defer the application, or whatever the rather complicated new process might be with the JDAPs. We cannot understand what deferral would achieve or how it would be managed, given the support of the DAC, the city's heritage team, the State Heritage Office, and the Planning Department. The project has been a long time in the making and is highly anticipated, and any further delay to the repair and the improvement of the locality would be disappointing, and this provides an opportunity to have a fantastic resolution to the Henderson Street precinct.
Thank you. I don't think the JDAP process is any different for you. I think it's just different for us. Any questions from the applicant's representative? Councillor Sullivan?
Just an initial, very quick one regarding the officers' parking recommendation. We have had similar ones in the West End where we've had very small car parks where the approval has been for long stay parking, but not for short stay parking, i.e. not something that was advertised to the general public. So I'm just putting in a question. You don't have to answer it now, but obviously it's going to JDAP. Would that be a sort of an in-between between having the officer's recommendation being no public parking or just having long stay parking, which you lease out to office workers and those sort of people, so that it's not something that the general public are looking to utilise? So just putting that as a question.
Can I just make a very brief comment on that? The Perth parking policy, which governs the CBD parking regime, is against long stay parking. We don't want to encourage commuters. It's not really, the idea isn't there to support people coming in, working all day and leaving, although that is less vehicle movements through the city. It's about enabling people to come and interact with the city and visit the markets and other things that are around. And
I don't wish to debate it, but sure. I guess the point of the approach that the City of Fremantle was using is that we didn't want to see lots of very small car parks. So, and the bigger car parks needed to be more on the periphery. So it was a question of where, and I think this is why the officers have written their recommendation, the idea of dragging people into that laneway in the possibility that there might be a car bay available in a very small car park is what is being objected to. But it might be possible to do it in a way that didn't invite the general public in. So between now and JDAP, I guess I would put it to you to try and answer that question in your own mind.
Any further questions of the applicant's representatives? No, thank you.
Thanks.
So I will move the officer's recommendation. As a seconder, Councillor Graham. I invite anybody who wishes to speak.
Looks like it's me.
Sorry, the diagram on page. I've lost it now. Where's the diagram that shows the heights? Yeah, page 46 might be helpful to people to follow the debate. Page 46 shows the heights, the discretionary heights, and the heights above discretionary heights. So that's page 46 in the agenda. Sorry, Councillor Grimm.
Yes, so I would like to move an alternative recommendation for Council's consideration, indicating to JDAP that we would not be prepared to support this proposal on the basis of height and the facade to the Waters cottages, and suggest that JDAP may give the applicant the opportunity to revisit those issues.
Is there a seconder for that amendment? Councillor Lorver. Any discussion of the amendment? I'm not going to restrict people to speaking once tonight, so don't, be a bit more relaxed.
I might talk to it if that's okay. So I agree with everything that the proponents' representatives have said. This is an incredibly important site. It was an important site previously for Fremantle, but it's even more important now because it just is this corner between the old, the convict establishment, the really important Waters cottages, which many people find one of the iconic buildings in Fremantle, and the new development we've seen, some of it not so wonderful, such as the car park and I guess the basis of the FOMO building, but also, the town hall and all that's happened in Walyalup Court. So getting this site right is really critical. And most important, it's critical for that respect that we pay to our heritage buildings and the old Fremantle. So what we were really hoping to see on the site was obviously a contemporary interpretation and response, but something that had the right scale and grain to respond appropriately to that. We're also, it was really important to us that this site would be well activated and used, and I certainly can say that I am really satisfied with those aspects of this proposal, the way that its streets are activated and the connection through to Paddy Troy Mall through the new lane, I think will really bring a lot of life to that part of the site. So none of my concerns are about the planning in terms of the layout of that development. However, this new building, and sort of note the statement that it's only 300 millimetres over the height. That's not a correct statement. So I want to explain the level of detail that council took in its planning scheme or in the amendment to think about the height of this site. They actually divided the site in half conceptually to set two different sites or two different heights across the site. So the part of the site that is facing the Waters Cottage has a 14-metre height limit. That's still probably too tall, and so it was a pragmatic response, but it said we need to scale and step anything on this site down to reflect and be respectful to the Waters Cottages. There's also there's wording in that height that allows the building to then transition up to the next part of the site to a higher part. So it was envisaged that part of 10A might go to 17 metres. The proponent has taken that as a limit, allowable limit of 17 metres across the entire of part 10A, or 10B, sorry, I've got that wrong, including onto the Henderson Street Cottage. That was never the intent of the scheme. And it was very clear that that was a highly nuanced response to respond to the Waters Cottage. Council spent a lot of time on that scheme amendment, site by site across the city, so that we could accommodate height in our city and density, but get these interfaces with the old Fremantle right. Council simply can't accept this height that just throws that work out that was done in so much consultation with the community and with good heritage advice. So, we need to wind back that height to come in line with what the scheme intention was. And then the second thing is the Henderson Street facade. The Waters Cottages, we're not going to recreate buildings such as were built 150 years ago because we don't have the affordability of labour or the same kind of building technology, but it is a really kind of rhythmic building that has both symmetry within the individual buildings and then the kind of symmetry across the site as that pattern repeats itself. The way that the verandas and the kind of facade of the building interact with the street is a really distinct form. And what we've got opposite is these, someone described them to me as brutal, kind of quite crude, wide columns, and then these balcony details that are all irregular and they have none of the pattern, that don't pick up any of the horizontality or the verticality of those buildings. So we just get this complete clash. And there is a particular drawing in the pack provided by the proponents that looks along the Henderson Street facade of this new building with the car park in the background. And if anything, it replicates the form of the car park, which is a really sorry state of affairs. I mean, most of us wish that car park in its Balkan form was never approved where it is. And to sort of pick up and use that as an excuse for the Balkan form of this new building is really disappointing at best. So I urge my fellow councillors to kind of not support this recommendation and really hold out in the belief that we can do better for our city and that we owe it to our city to try to do better and get better outcomes.
Thank you. Councillor Lorva?
Yes, I just want to thank Councillor Groom for putting together this alternate recommendation, and I won't repeat the comments you just made about the height and how it relates to the Waters Cottages, because I agree with all of them. The part that I want to bring up for me is, and this is no surprise to my fellow councillors, is in front of this proposed hotel, we are giving up a lot of public parking that's normally, well, right now, brings money into our coffers. And I think the staff was right to, I know it's not a planning, but the staff was right to reject the public parking under, or to not recommend that, because that's a something that would just be transferring those parking fees into here. But in those And I was repeatedly told during that the amenity of the street would be better. We would have a better public realm if we give these up. It's going to be a lot nicer of a space. And I can see that because it would be a nice place to walk around. But looking at the shadows from the height of this proposed building, it's going to be in shade most of the time. I'm not even sure the trees that are there are actually going to survive. On June 21st at noon, it's going to be in 100% shade. 2 p.m. on December 21st, almost 100% shade. So I think by stepping down the height or by hopefully reducing that bulk, you not only have a better relationship to the Waters College, we actually create a better public amenity, one that we're giving up a city asset for. So I think that would be something to consider. So that's an additional reason as to why I'm supporting the alternate recommendation, in addition to what Councillor Groom said.
Thank you. Councillor Sullivan.
Thank you, and thanks for Councillor Groom for preparing the draft alternative motion. And I had a lot of conversations with her about it, and I fully support it. I think I'm the only person currently sitting in this room who was even part of the deliberations of Amendment 49. So I will speak to that because I think that's the critical part of this, and it's about trying to have the understanding that the council of the day was incredibly progressive, incredibly determined to see significant redevelopment of the city centre and to save Fremantle as we know it. And that determination was to go through site by site, street by street, streetscape by streetscape, heritage precinct by heritage precinct, and review the scale that it felt could be accommodated in each area. And where it was possible to allow more development and where it wasn't possible to set limits on development. And as Councillor Groom rightly said, on this site, more than most of the other sites, we even went to the extent of dividing the site into two parcels from a planning perspective, because the concern that was raised at the time was both in terms of the importance of protecting the convict establishment buffer zone, but also, as Councillor Lorver just mentioned, protecting the urban environment that exists in one of our streets that's been converted into a mall. And the conversations that were had at the time were that the scale of the buildings around that mall and the sun penetration into that mall were as important as protecting the convict era establishment, convict establishment buffer zone. Because one of the reasons the mall exists and is so popular is because of the urban environment that exists in that space. So it became very, very clear. But we also very, clearly understood the importance of getting the centre highly developed, and the fact that the Spicer building that existed in that place in the first place was the tallest building short of the Town Hall Tower in William Street by a long shot. If you look down William Street now, you see the outcome of the heights that have been achieved over the road. And I have to say, I actually argued for taller buildings in the government building in the core of it. I said, that's one spot in the overall area where you could get a taller building. And we equally argued that the bulk of this site could have taller buildings. But to come along and then say, oh, we'll just add another story along Henderson Street is kind of taking all of that good work and disregarding it. The second thing I want to say is this notion, and it's coming up on multiple times at the moment, this notion that the town planning scheme can be considered that the use of clause 4.8.1 basically can be used to override a whole process that was done with the community where individual heights were set, that a general clause of the scheme that says, well, if there's a building nearby that's taller, the council can allow a similarly tall building. Why would we do that? Why would any planner do that when you have already been through the process, site by site, street by street, articulating the height? The general clause should not override the very, very detailed, specific site by site analysis that exists in the scheme. Because if we allow that sort of approach, then every new building becomes the town planning scheme. And clearly, we didn't want in Amendment 49 for every site to have exactly the same height. We very, very clearly as a community said each individual site has to be a response to the environment that it sits within. And that's how that scheme was written. So we have I guess, a challenge in a sense. Now, having said all that, I mean, I support what Councillor Groom has put in place. I also support the development in principle. It's a great opportunity. And there is an opportunity if the developer was so inclined to take the most important part of that site and develop it with essentially the 4-story rather than 5-story building on Henderson Street, but still achieve the capacity of that site by shifting the floor that would be lost along that frontage to the core of the site. And I would have no problem with that at all, in exactly the same way as I had no problem with there being a taller building directly over the road in William Street in that particular environment. So I don't see this as a limitation on development. I just see what we have right now is a limitation on ideas. The capacity to do this development and to have exactly the same number of rooms, plus or minus one probably, is there, and we can get an even better outcome. And so I put it to the developers that the notion of basically not refusing it, but being in a position where we're not prepared to support it and ask that they come back with an alternative is exactly what we should be doing. And I hope also that the JDAP also look at it. And let's get this right because it is so important, as Councillor Groom said. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to speak without closing the debate, if nobody objects to that. I won't be closing the debate, but I just want to make a couple of comments. No, I'm not closing the debate. I'm sorry. I just want to make a couple of comments in direct reference to what Councillor Sullivan said. I may not have been on council for the Town Planning Scheme Amendment 49, but I spent all afternoon reading the final item that went to council, which was about 100 pages long, and included about 50 amendments and 50 votes. And I've also read the public submissions. And one of the public submissions was from the Heritage Council, which says, and I quote, basically they say that they're concerned about some of the heights proposed adjacent to heritage buildings, and as a result of their comments, the proposal was changed in regard to areas 2, 6A, 6B, 7, 8, 10A, and 10B, those being the subject sites here, where the heights were reduced to give recognition to the heritage buildings adjacent. So the heights you see on page 45 are the ones that aren't yellow and aren't red, are the heights recommended by the Heritage Council of WA. It's interesting, when this proposal, exactly as it is, was sent to the Heritage Council of WA, they didn't object to the yellow and red parts. I find that interesting and challenging. So I just make those points, and I think we'll be having more discussion later, but the only way that extra height can be allowed under the scheme is by the application of 4.8.1, which allows the height to be increased if there is a higher building adjacent. Okay, and we've had a lot of discussion about the word adjacent. and I agree with Councillor Sullivan, it seems a long bow to me to use the word adjacent and a special clause 4.8.1, which is discretionary, to use on a site which has a site-specific town planning scheme amendment attached to it. So, and this is where I think Mr. Dowson's absolutely right. If JDAP and the various authorities allow that interpretation of the town planning scheme, then as soon as one person gets an extra height under 49 amendments, anybody between them and a visible higher building can get the same height. And that basically works its way around the whole of the city and seems extremely inconsistent. So I just want to make those points without closing the debate. And I'll Councillor Lang.
Thanks. Everything's been covered off by my colleagues very well, very succinctly. I just want to thank the applicant for this proposal they put forward. I think there's a lot to like about this development, what it's offering in this former car park. I know there's been a lot of consideration. I've been involved in some consultation with the applicant going back over a couple of years. We were doing workshops in Paddy Troy Mall, and this was over 2.5 years ago, and members from the applicant's team were there, understanding what we were trying to achieve in Paddy Troy Mall, taking that information back and incorporating that into design. And I can see it coming through now. So I think from that perspective, there's lots to like about this design. However, in terms of the community feedback that I've been getting, I don't think I've received any positive feedback on it whatsoever, which is somewhat concerning. I personally do like what the development is trying to achieve, but I'm conscious that whatever my colleagues have mentioned, and being adjacent to this World Heritage Site, we absolutely need to get this right the first time. So I 100% support the deferral that Councillor Groom has put forward, so we can work with the applicant to get this site right for Freo, because it could be there for another 100 years itself. So I'm 100% support of this, so we can find the right solution. Thanks for bringing it up, Councillor Graham.
Councillor Graham.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I've got a croaky throat, so excuse me. Look, yeah, I mean, this is a tricky one. Fremantle has been talking about heights for a long time, and we'll be talking about it a lot tonight, most probably. But there is a lot of height now in Fremantle, and I don't think it's such a bad thing. This is certainly a better project than the Suffolk Street Hotel, which is mostly of similar height. That was about 6 stories. Little Lane over here is about 6 stories. I mean, you wouldn't rave about that project either, I wouldn't think, the more it's progressed, but good luck to the people who live there and wish them well. So I don't think we should be getting bogged down in this continual height issue. I know the Freo Society have been on its bandwagon for 30, 40 years. But, you know, I recall back in the early 2000s, we were approving 5-story buildings in the West End. You know, so this is really just 1 story more. So I'm just putting it out there that, you know, we seem to be getting down in this continually bogged down height issue, when if you've got a good application, well, you know, you've got to balance it out, and you just can't throw it out the baby with the dishwater just because, oh, it's a 1 story too high when it's quite a good application. In my view, this isn't a terribly bad application. It's a site that is certainly a better site for a hotel than Suffolk Street. I mean, for heavens forbid, I hope that never gets built, but anyway, it most probably will one day. So I think the planners and everyone's got this one right for what the use is of the site. You know, I just hope that there's some compromise that can be made. Obviously, the deferral is going to get up, and I'll support that tonight. But I do have a bit of sympathy for the applicants and the height in this matter, because I do think we continually talk ourselves, if you like, down on height, when we should be perhaps looking a bit more strategic and looking at the good applications instead of just throwing it out. My major concern with this all along has been parking in the public realm. I believe that this doesn't form part of that application. I think if council does lose bays at the front of Henderson Street there, at some point the applicant should be recompensing the city for those. If you look at all the major hotels in Perth, like the Sheraton and Parmelia and so, but all their parking goes into there. They don't use any public car bays. So, you know, if we're going to lose all those bays on the Henderson Street opposite the Waters Cottage, I mean, that's a considerable expense to the council. And I would be expecting that if negotiations go forward on that, we would be getting a fair financial return on that if they do take them over. So that's my view on it. We'll see where it takes us in another few months, I suppose.
Clarify with the officers, I think there may be some misunderstanding. We're not taking the whole story off the hotel, I don't think. If we look at page 45, I think we're taking off one story off the front 9 metres, and it doesn't actually say that specifically there. I just want to clarify this. It says reduce the Henderson Street facade, and are we all assuming that means the 9 metres as specified in the setback? Is that clearly understood by everybody? So we're not taking a whole story off the whole hotel. We're taking one story off the front 9 metres of the facade facing Henderson Street. Yep, we're all clear on that. Yep, and that's the way you understand it? Yep. Okay.
Thank you. Am I on? Yep. Thank you. Yes, look, I agree with all the comments that my colleagues have made, and I just wanted to say that when we sit here in this room and we hear people say we want to do the right thing by Fremantle, I think they need to remember how long it took to get Fremantle to be what Fremantle is today. A lot longer than 1.5 years working on a development application. And I hope that the applicant can see it in the context of spending perhaps a few more months to get something that does balance well with the Henderson Street cottages and the ambience of the city. So I think I really urge the applicant to think carefully about the Henderson Street frontage and dropping it back. The council guidelines do say so that you can stand on the footpath and you can look up and you don't see the additional height that's behind, and that to me has worked. I feel has worked quite well around the city. So, you know, if that can be done, it just is much more respectful to the cottages that are opposite. The prison, I remember that being decommissioned in 1991, one of those 2 years, and a great deal of work was done by many people to try and save that site, and that includes the Henderson Street cottages. It then went on fantastically to become World Heritage listed as part of a serial listing. It really is a significant site, and the cottages need to be thought of in that sense. And I think the idea of having a hotel on that site is fabulous. I have no issue at all with the use. I just think we need to get that Henderson Street frontage corrected. So I do urge the applicant to not see this as a negative, but to work with the council to get a much better result, so that it can be genuinely a building that is worthy in its own right. And so I would seriously ask that you do spend the extra time to work on this and get the balance correct. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say earlier, focused on a lot of the negative aspects of this. There are a lot of positive aspects as well. So I just wanted to remind the applicants that, you know, we do, I think, in spirit, or at least I do, like the development, but it could really be improved, especially when the council is being asked to give up so much to create a good public realm. Let's make sure that this development will create a good public realm. So,
A procedural question of the officers: if members of the committee did want to discuss the parking, should that be done before we vote on this amendment, or after we've done this amendment we can then discuss the detail of the RAR? I think if we
At any stage. Yep. You can now, if you like.
We can do it separately? Yeah, okay. So we can deal with it separately. If we do want to discuss parking, we can do that as a separate item. Okay. Anybody else wishing to speak? Well, if there's no one else, you can close the debate. I just want to make one more comment. In the amendment that's been sought, we're not refusing to use 4.8.1. I just want to make that clear. I mean, I don't think it should be being used. We're still allowing a considerable amount of extra height by the use of 4.8.1, but we're asking for a change on the Henderson Street facade. So I still have issues with the use of that, and I think that's something we'll have to come back to as a council. But we're not taking away all the discretionary height at all. In my view, this is quite a minor amendment. Shouldn't really cripple the project at all. And my advice to the applicants would be to work with it and try and get a solution. Because the biggest single issue raised with us has been the interface with the Henderson Street and the Waters Cottages. And the Waters Cottages would have to be the kind of humblest, smallest heritage buildings, except for places like Cossack, in Western Australia. And I think I was interested to read in the Heritage Report, it does make the point, these cottages are very small. They were actually for two families. There was a family downstairs, a family upstairs, and they had a kitchen and a toilet out the back. And later in history, modifications were made, so they got a kitchen each, I think. And they lived in there until, I think, they had to live in there until, I think, 1948, I think, in the report. So if you worked at the prison, you had to live in those houses with your family until 1948. So I think that's a really special piece of heritage, and that's why I think people are so concerned about respecting it. Councillor Sullivan, you wish to speak again?
I just wanted to provide clarity on that from my own perspective as well, because I made a lot of comment about 4.8.1. What I object to fundamentally is when a detailed planning process has occurred, that 4.1 is used to completely usurp it. What I don't have a problem with in theory, I'm not convinced it should legally be the reality, but if we are going to use 4.8.1, then the guiding principles behind the planning instrument that were agonized over for so long should still be the guiding principles. And that's the critical bit. And the most critical part of those guiding principles was the protection in scale in Henderson Street. And so as long as this development achieves that, but if there is additional height that's beyond the scheme in another location that doesn't impact the principles, then this council has shown itself to be very, very reasonable about that. But don't throw the principles out when we use clause 4.8.1. That's the key.
Thank you. Anybody wish to speak before Councillor Groom closes the debate? Okay. So I advise if we do want to do anything about parking, we need to do it before as part of this amendment. So does anybody want to discuss that now? Or
That's all I would say. If we pass this amendment, the parking is a matter that could be left to JDAP because it's not,
well, we can actually amend the RAR to include a reference to public parking, and then we'll have the referral, the RAR amended, and then the RAR unamended. So just think if that's what you'd like to do. Well, it only requires the insertion of a couple of words, I think.
Chairman, if we're going to do it, I would argue simply that the best way to deal with it is like we've done elsewhere, which is to advise the applicant. It could be a footnote to Councillor Groom's thing. Advise the applicant that the council would not accept short stay parking facility in the basement, but would accept long stay parking. We don't have to finesse it. We could probably just move it as simply as that. And between now and the JDAP, the officers could probably formulate it in a much more succinct and structured way.
As an addition to this, and are you happy to close while that's being typed?
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
In this new process, so this alternate recommendation takes the place of the entire staff recommendation?
I'll ask the acting director to answer that.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a confusing process, but all council is being asked to do tonight is to either endorse the officer's recommendation or provide their own. So what will happen in the report that goes to JDAP is that it'll be very clear that the responsible authority recommendation, being the City of Fremantle, yourselves, would be this recommendation with this new little addition to it referring to the parking. And then there'll be a section very clearly saying that the officer's recommendation is this. So it's really just clarifying whose recommendation is whose, because I think local governments are all doing it very differently. So the Department of Planning is very nicely, step by step at the top of the template that we all use, said this is how you must do it. But really it will be clear whose recommendation is whose. So JDAP will have consideration of both. We will also include the reasons that have been drafted up as well. So they're very clear as to what occurs, because they will be part of the minutes as well. So they'll know the reasons behind it.
And JDAP can choose the officers RAR if they wish. You happy to close while those words are drafted? So no further comment before Councillor Groom closes the debate.
Closing, is she moving that amendment as part of her alternative? Just to proceed.
Well, I might start talking and make sure I add it before I shut up.
We'll make sure it's up on the screen before you finish. Right.
I just wanted to clarify on the height debate. So the last sentence of my reasons in the recommendation reads, the additional height, if required, should be accommodated within the site where it does not impact on streetscapes. So as referenced in the discussion, we're not saying absolutely no height. We are looking for the Henderson Street to be protected and that scheme to be honoured. The final thing I wanted to say in closing is that we hear a lot how a few experts who are given a position to advise the city are actually the experts that we have to listen to and almost the decision makers. Heritage is not owned by a few experts, and particularly not by the design community. Heritage is owned by our entire community. And we've all taken a lot of feedback and followed the debate and seen the kind of great depth of emotional attachment to this part of our city. And, you know, I get quite offended when people come into the chamber and tell us because a panel of a few design experts have decided something is the way it is, that we need to take that as gospel instead of listening to our whole community. So I think it is something we continually do, and there's a current debate in the development world in Perth about getting rid of councils altogether from the planning process. But planning is far more complex than the views of designers or the views of planners. It is the views of our whole community, and the whole job of planning is to balance all those views and perspectives to meet the needs of our community in a really complex way, which is beyond the needs of the development industry. So I'm glad that we've got the opportunity to try and communicate to JDAP our feelings in that space and the needs of our community.
A comment about the parking
I
added
will
to the...
just move a small change to my amendment, which is that we ask JDAP to revisit the basement parking for long stay use only.
Everybody happy to vote? Okay. Second, Councillor Lover, yep. So it's been moved and seconded. All those in favour of the amendment? That's unanimous, thank you. We don't have a date for that JDAP meeting yet, but you can check with the officers and find out when. Pause for a minute while if those people want to leave the room, or unless you want to stay for the rest of the night's entertainment. So the next item is Queen Victoria Street, St Patrick's Centre. I've got 3 people wishing to speak against. I'll take those people first, and I've got 6 people wishing to speak for. I'm not sure if they all want to, but we'll see at the time. Against the officer's recommendation, I'll have Gary Adams. So you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I live with my young family in the terrace houses immediately next door to the proposed development. These were built in 1896 and have a heritage classification of level 1B. This means that they will likely always be residential premises with little opportunity for future development or change of use. Once this application is approved, the lack of consideration for our amenity will be set in stone. This proposal seeks to vary the most important planning guidelines in terms of amenity for us as existing residents: height, setbacks, and parking. Sound planning principles cannot simply be overlooked because a community service is being provided. Many of St. Pat's clients are dealing with complex issues that contribute to them being homeless or at risk of homelessness, which makes it even more important that we get the planning elements right. As neighbours, we already experience noise and behaviours that are beyond what would be expected of a standard residential development. The setbacks required by State Planning Policy 7.3, Element 2.7 for levels 5 to 8 are to be set back 9 metres from the boundary. The plans show a setback of 7.5 metres for level 6, with the floors below even closer. This approval will mean extra height above 18 metres and a relaxation of setback requirements. These residences will have an outdoor space that faces directly onto our properties and will impact on our ability to enjoy our own properties. These outdoor spaces are likely to be the primary living and entertaining spaces for the residents. The applicant also intends to rely heavily on ambitious landscaping design and ongoing maintenance to provide visual relief, and they've argued that the planter boxes on the balconies will stop people hanging clothes over the balcony whilst no communal drying facilities exist in the plans. A detailed landscaping plan is a condition of approval. However, if it fails, I wonder how the city's compliance team would go about forcing a charitable organisation to implement an expensive remedy. At present, there are 6 parking bays proposed, when a compliant development would have 47 bays, a shortfall of 41 bays. Whilst it is stated that 95% of current short-term clients do not have cars, and the applicant has stated that the proposed long-term residents will be selected on this basis, it's somewhat fanciful to think that someone would not be housed due to owning a vehicle or be evicted if they became a car owner during their stay. Even if some concession is granted for the lack of car ownership, there will still be visitors to the property who have cars, and there is a significant office space that should also require at least some parking. Whilst I'm supportive of St. Pat's and the work they do, I would ask the committee not to support this application without further consideration of the impacts of the setbacks, the height and the parking, and without the finalisation of the detailed landscaping plan and a revised waste management plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions of the neighbour? Thank you.
Just a question. I did submit 3 questions that I intended to ask in public question time. I'm just wondering if the director could provide an email response to those questions, given that I didn't ask them.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, we have those. Yep. John Dowson, please. 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, look, we spent so much time on this Weiser site one that we didn't have much time to spend on the St. Pat's. But there's 1 or 2 issues, I think, that come up with this application as has with others, and that is the use of precedent. And it's very concerning to see applicants sort of look around town for some extra height somewhere and say, well, look at that over there. We want that. And Councillor Graham referenced the awful yoke block of flats set at 6 stories. In actual fact, that block of flats is about 8 stories, and when you look around the street from a distance and see all that rubbish on top, all those air conditioners and stuff that have not been conditioned by council and should have, they are simply mimicking Johnson Court. And we were told that Johnson Court would never be allowed again in Fremantle. And so that promise didn't lasted a few decades. But what we've now got is developers looking at things like Johnson Court and now looking at the Live building. I mean, the Live building is an outrage. It totally swamps the wool stores across the road, and that went through council and JDAP, and now people are using that as a precedent. So my concern with the St Pat's one is that the objections that were raised by DAC and even by the heritage officer haven't been addressed. I mean, the applicant doesn't have to. He just says, I'm going to JDAP. So issues like the cantilevered design, the exceeding the height limit, I mean, 18 metres is the height limit, that has been exceeded. So height is hugely important. And I think if you want people to come and live in the city of Fremantle, like Gary Adams, you have to try and protect what they've got and what they've invested in. So thank you for your debate on the Spicer building. But my closing comment is that I think all you seem to have done is shift a bit of bulk from one part of the development to the other. So I think you're actually ending up with still the same problem of excessive bulk and scale. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got Donna Ayres.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, councillors and staff, my name's Donna Ayres.
You need to point straight at your mouth.
Is that better? Yeah. My name's Donna Ayres. I'm one of the owners of 24 Queen Victoria Street, a neighbour of St Pat's. I'm speaking on behalf of myself and also another neighbour, Sarah Lefwich. She lives at number 18 Queen Victoria Street with her 2 young daughters. We'd like to acknowledge the really good work of St Pat's. They relocated in 2007-8 next door to us. They jam a lot of services in for a lot of people who are homeless and at risk, and I think that's it's commendable and it's worth noting. There's a lot of redeeming features from the development application. I think it takes services off the footpath, which is only good for the dignity of people. And the relocation to Beach Street, I think, is very good. It's a quieter, safer street. The main issue that we have as neighbours is the impact on our amenity of the overlooking onto the rear of our properties. So it's in terms of the potential loss of privacy from 28 residents overlooking our backyard. They'll potentially look into our bedrooms, which are at the rear of the property, into our bathrooms, our kitchen. These old terrace houses, we've got very large windows, often 2 metres by 1 metre. The back window's 3 metres, I think, by 2. And covering up these windows to try to afford us some privacy. Really dark, it will darken already dark terrace houses. They're quite dark anyway. I think it's a really big impost on our privacy, and I don't think it's necessary, given that these places will face into our backyards when there's also considering the impact on the streetscape of what is quite I'll use the term boxy, the sort of unusual shape of a building. So the streetscape, I think, is negatively impacted, and I think this can be amended by reorientating the building so that the openings of the buildings are onto the street. The other impact is on noise, but I don't know that can really be ameliorated that much by reorientating the buildings. To give you an impression, a picture of our buildings, there's a lot of high walls with the coal storers, and it actually becomes quite a sound bowl for noise. What else did I want to cover? The reliance on planting. I think that's commendable. I think it's attractive. However, plantings generally afford the person on the balcony more privacy than it affords the people that they're overlooking. So I think there's benefits for the 28 residents, but they'll still look into our bedrooms, even through the plants or from within their property. Lastly, some of the secondary issues that I'd like to draw your attention to. One is the collection of bins. The bins can't be collected without the rubbish trucks blocking our right of way. Only this morning I waited about 10 to 15 minutes while the rubbish truck emptied the 6 or 7 bins. This can be rectified quite easily, I think, by relocating all of the bins onto the Beach Street property. So bins are in 2 locations. It's a lesser of an issue. I don't want to draw from attention from the impacts on amenity. Parking impacts. The street's a really busy street, so not providing any additional parking will cause stress in an already stressed area. And I'd like to reiterate the comments of the 2 previous speakers in terms of height. I don't think the issues of points about setting precedents here, but I don't think the heights actually consider the height of our building at 9 metres, the height of the, no, actually I think, Cold Store's building at about 8 metres, and the 12 metres of the Stella Maris building in terms of the proposal for this 23.25 metre building. So there's a lot of attention drawn to what's big and what's already above the planning limits, but what's right next door, it's really quite small, and I think this will dominate the streetscape. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Councillor Groom.
Yeah, sorry, I meant to ask this of the other speaker, so either one of you may be in the best position to answer, sorry, the other owner. So my impression of the backyard areas is that they, at least the 2 next to the site, are undercover. Could you explain a bit more what's...
Yeah, so the immediate neighbour is mostly undercover, but there is an area which is not covered, which you can look in through, and that's on the southerly side of her backyard. The next neighbour at number 20 is entirely enclosed. Gary, who's at number 22, is shade cloth, and we are completely open. We have no covering whatsoever.
Okay, thank you.
Mine's only covered by a grapevine. The grapevine and the olive tree.
Yep. Yep.
Any further questions? Councillor Groom, microphone's on. 6 people to speak for the officer recommendations. Is there any particular order? I've got Michael Pugh first. You want to go first? Thank you.
Good evening, councillors. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Like all urban areas we see around the world, Fremantle CBD is one of those where the face of homelessness is very evident. And for 50 years, St Patrick's has been leading community action to end homelessness. We know from overseas and local experience that whilst we're not able to stop people experiencing homelessness, we can ensure that it's brief and not repeated. And to do this, what we need to do is effectively reach people as early as possible, either before they become homeless or as soon as possible thereafter. Rapidly provide people with experiencing homelessness with stable and suitable housing without precondition, and provide the right range of services to support the individual to sustain their housing and thrive. It's this thinking which has driven St Pat's proposal for redevelopment before the committee tonight. We have successfully operated on this site for over a decade now, and in the immediate area for around, well, exactly 50 years. We now want to enhance the functionality and utility of these facilities in Fremantle to meet current and future needs informed by the evidence. Our proposal delivers significant value for Fremantle, includes quality and dignified long-term housing for people exiting homelessness, a modern facility that not only will effectively support our core client group, but benefit the whole community. These include a social enterprise cafe and other community facilities where all will be welcome. This approach will bring the community together, serving to break down stigma, as well as allowing us to reach those in need earlier and thereby prevent as well as reduce the impacts of homelessness. St Pat's has had a strong track record of success in delivering community housing and support services, and is considered a leader in the field of homelessness in WA. This provides council and the community with the reassurance that what we're proposing is well thought out, evidence-based and well managed. All elements of our proposal are critically interlinked, and so it's essential that it be approved as a totality. A delay to approval of the whole proposal will not only consume critical resources for St Patrick's, but could well endanger the whole project, as the time is of the essence in securing the DA as a precursor to securing necessary elements of our funding. Indeed, it could be put even the future of our existing accommodation provision on site at risk, as it's reaching the end of its useful life and needs to be addressed as a priority. We'd be grateful, therefore, for the committee's support of the office's recommendations as presented. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Thank you. Clayton Plug, would you like to go next?
Excuse me. Good evening, councillors. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. My name is Clayton Plug, town planner at Harley Dykstra, and we've been assisting our client St Pat's on this application. Just like to briefly begin by noting support for the council staff recommendation. Commend the officers for their work with us on this throughout the process. I'd like to discuss the alternative motion that I've reviewed that's before you this evening. And in particular, I'd like to speak to the building height matter. We've obviously heard a lot about building height this evening, and so I'll sort of try to interact with some of that. But before I do so, I just wanted also to confirm the council's RAR does confirm that the proposed setbacks and the associated visual privacy elements of this development do comply with the R codes and the relevant policies. So that's in relation to the comments made earlier about the setback issue and the visual privacy issues. So in relation to height then, the alternative recommendation that obviously seeks to defer the application is doing so on height, and sort of seems to indicate that the additional height's not warranted in this location. So I'd just like to address some of the reasons given, and in doing so, confirm compliance with the city's scheme. The interesting part about the alternative motion is that it indicates that the building approved on the adjacent site doesn't warrant the acceptance of additional building height in this instance, and it seems to be because it hasn't been built yet. However, that building was only approved under the same set of rules just last year in June 2021. So importantly, the bulk and height of that development, in our view at least, is much more imposing on the street than what's proposed by the St Pat's development. And the key here is the setback from the street. The development before you tonight significantly set back from the street, which in my view at least serves to ameliorate the impact of the additional height that would have on the surrounding amenity. The portion of the development that's over 22 metres in height, which of course is only the lift shaft and some additional shading, so not the significant building bulk, that's set back some 35 metres from the street. And the actual bulk of the building is 21 metres in height, which is 1 metre under the 22 metre additional height limit. But it's still set back from the street by 16 metres, as opposed to the bulk being at the street boundary, as is the case on the adjacent approved development. So given those significant setbacks, and the streetscape along Queen Victoria Street is well respected, because the Stella Maris building remains at the forefront of the site, with the bulk of the development occurring well behind it in the street, or setback from the street. The building, therefore, itself imposes far less than the recently approved development next door to the site. And so in that sense, the additional height cannot be readily seen from the street. The clause in Schedule 7 talks about the additional height not being able to be seen. However, whilst technically speaking, it could be viewed from the street, the user would have to be specifically looking for it given the setback from the street. So one of the common sort of planning principles in terms of dealing with additional height is a consideration of how far the building is set back from the street. And usually that's considered at least to be an ameliorating factor when you've got an additional height on a building. So in that sense, we concur with the city's justification for the additional height of the building, because the impact on the streetscape is managed in a way that's acceptable, in our view at least. I'd just like to interact, if I can, with the comments on clause 4.8.1, and obviously we've heard a lot about that this evening, which I appreciate. I guess the question that I've got is, clause 4.8.1 specifically references Schedule 7, which is, of course, the schedule that limits height, amongst other things. And so, therefore, in our view, the use of this clause to justify additional height is correct. And that's because the scheme sometimes can be, I guess, a blunt instrument. And I hear the point about, that in particular, Schedule 7 was derived over a lot of discussions and was a nuanced amendment to the scheme. However, it still applies to a broad area in the sense that it breaks up the city of Fremantle into various sub-precincts. And so in this particular case, we don't have building or building height right on the street right on the street frontage line as you would normally see in a lot of development. We have a building that is instead set back well from the well back from the street. And I don't know. I'm not so sure that particular element of it would have been considered when Schedule 7 was prepared. And so that's, in my view, is why clause 4.8.1 is there, to allow nuanced decisions where you've got unique scenarios such as this one where we've got a setback, significant setback from the street. And in that case, I do believe that the use of clause 4.8.1 is applicable in this specific instance. So in that case, we're of the view that the proposed height of the building is appropriate, and I hope that that your view will concur with that. We welcome the debate around it, but no, I do thank you for your time this evening, and do request that the council's recommendations put forward, as we've already heard this evening. The St. Pat's, they have a very valuable community service, and this particular development would continue to allow them to enhance and deliver that. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Any questions from the speaker? Thank you. So the next speaker we've got is Bill Coe.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Bill Coe. I'm from Slaven Architects, who are the architects for the project. I'm going to speak to the proposed alternative recommendation that the 6-storey accommodation component of this project cannot be supported on the grounds that it is too tall, it does not provide scale graduation away from the existing terrace houses to the north, and the cantilevered portion of the development is crude and overbearing. On the issue of height, and separate to the points just made by Clayton, and partly in response to an earlier comment that precedents were used to justify the height, we would like the committee to consider the advice of the city's planning department and their own design advisory committee. We first consulted with the city's planning department back in January 2021, when this project was in its infancy, and our brief from St. Pat's was to provide vital social infrastructure in the form of 30 long-term accommodation units. Subsequent to our initial meeting, we attended 2 other early engagement sessions with the city's planning department. These meetings were attended by Julia Kingsbury, who at the time was a manager of development approvals, and Paul Garblett, the director of planning. The first concept we presented to the city was actually for a 5-storey accommodation building with 29 units. This building had a street frontage some 9 metres wider than the final submitted design. The advice from Julia and Paul was to increase the height of the development to 6 stories and pull back the mass from the northern and southern boundaries. I think it's important when we talk about height to give some acknowledgement to the fact that we have really pulled this building back from the southern boundary to reduce impact on the development to the south, and the step nature of the northern development is set back a lot further than it needs to be as well. So the city's planning advice was to increase the height to 6 stories and orientate all the units north to provide each apartment with cross ventilation. At our third meeting, the city's planning department also suggested we have a pre-lodgement meeting with the city's DAC, which we did. At that meeting with DAC, as was the case with all our planning meetings, height was never raised as a concern. In fact, an outcome from our first meeting with DAC was a recommendation to increase the height of the building even further to improve the floor-to-floor heights of each unit. We incorporated this recommendation in our final presentation to the DAC. The height of the building that has been submitted for approval is underpinned by the shared message from both the city's planning department and the DAC that the height is appropriate, and one of the reasons for the RAR report that recommends to approve a development. Another point in the alternative recommendation is that there are no buildings adjacent to the site that exceeds 18 metres. I think that's misleading, as there are two approved schemes directly south to the building at 1 Beach Street and 8 Victoria Street, which are both taller than the subject building. In counter to the alternative recommendation, we also submit that other than the very obvious environmental and overlooking benefits, the step nature of the northern facade manifestly provides scaled graduation from the terraced houses to the north of the site. The comment about the cantilevered component of the building contributing to the visibility of the development from the street on a massive scale is simply not true. The street view that was shared with the committee members yesterday shows a building mass that sits differentially behind the ridgeline of the Stella Maris building. It is 14.5 metres wide, which is less than half the width of the street frontage of the Stella Maris building. Only the top two units of the development are visible, and most importantly, the face of the building is set back 16 metres from the street. We reject any notion that the cantilevered component is overbearing, and I think the image that was shared with committee members yesterday shows that the accommodation building has no impact whatsoever on how the facade of the Stella Maris building is experienced at street level. Lastly, on the recommendation to remove the 3 cantilevered units, our whole design team, and I think the city as well, has a social obligation to provide as many homes as possible. Each unit we provide will turn a life around. Apart from the obvious impact of reducing the number of homes St. Pat's are able to provide, the impact of removing the 3 cantilevered units severely impacts the viability of the project. This is not a commercial venture. St. Pat's are a charitable organisation who rely on heavily subsidised rents to provide shelter for the most vulnerable people in our community. Removing 3 units not only reduces passive funding, but also increases the cost per unit of the development. The 3 cantilevering units cannot be relocated to the southern boundary, as this would compromise communal spaces to an unworkable degree and not allow the best practice solar passive design that underpins the entire development. That's all.
Thank you. Any questions? Councillor Lang.
Yeah, just a quick one. In response to the comments from the neighbours about the balconies and the occupants looking into the yards, have you got any comment or any response to that at all?
Well, other than the fact that the setbacks are fully comply with the R codes and any other planning policy, I think the fact that the balustrades for those apartments are solid, they won't be glazed, they won't be wire, they'll be planter boxes, they won't be 50 mil deep, they'll be at a minimum 750 mil deep enough to support a garden bed, and then the intention of the landscaping design will be to improve privacy, and not just for the terrace houses to the north, but for the occupants of the units. Privacy goes both ways. They don't want to be sitting in their balcony with people looking up at them either.
Yeah, all right, thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned that you were really pleased with the design, the DAC and the staff and all that work. And I was just wondering, what part of the plans that are put before us address the DAC's concerns about that wall on Queen Victoria Street? Because they pretty clearly, it says that the new proposed upper accommodation presents with a highly visible blank wall towards Queen Victoria Street. It remains a built form that does not actively engage with the street or enhance passive surveillance. The blank wall treatment misses opportunity to incorporate openings, which would enhance the amenity. And then they also go on to say in a separate part that this proposed banding to the blank wall serves only to emphasize its scale and visually dominate an invasive presence. So I'm just wondering, what did, in your design, did you do to address those concerns by the deck?
Well, we didn't necessarily agree that any of those were concerns. I think it's pretty hard to engage with the street when you're 16 metres back from it and up on the third level. Remembering the first two floors are not an accommodation in this development. We also didn't think fenestrating an eastern facade was justifiable from an environmental point of view, and the banded articulation is a generic representation of what that wall could be. We see it as a canvas for a public art project, which I thought we explained in our email to you guys yesterday.
Any further questions? Thank you. And the next speaker we have is Stuart Neal.
Good evening, councillors and council staff. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight, and specifically in respect to the proposed alternative recommendation to be tabled tonight. The proposed alternative recommendation states that council is supportive of development at the rear of the Stella Maris building, where it is set a respectful distance behind the Stella Maris building. So what defines respectful distance? Is it 4 metres? Is it 8 metres? Is it 20 metres? So in considering the term respectful in relation to places of heritage significance, such as the Stella Maris building, the cultural values of the Stella Maris building must be considered or understood. When considering the cultural values that contribute to the heritage significance of a place, such as Stella Maris, application of the principles and practices of the Icamos Borough Charter are considered best practice and are adopted by the Heritage Council of Western Australia. The Borough Charter defines cultural values in 5 ways. The criteria are aesthetic, historic, scientific, social, and spiritual. Aesthetic value refers to the sensory and perceptual experience of a place and may include special attractive qualities involving combinations of colour, textures or spaces, or if the place is in a distinctive setting, such as a landscaped garden, or is a prominent visual landmark. In assessing the cultural values of the Stella Maris building, and in particular what is considered respectful of its aesthetic values, reference must be made to the Heritage Council of WA's Statement of Significance for that place. The registered Statement of Significance for the Stella Maris lists the following reasons for the place being of cultural heritage significance. The first one is the place is a fine example of Federation Romanesque style building with rock-faced stone facades and towers with pyramid roofs. The second is that the place is an integral part of the Catholic Church group of buildings. And the third is that the place has social significance for associations with the Stella Maris Club. So the Statement of Significance does not attribute aesthetic values of the place as being a prominent landmark or a place located in a distinctive setting. However, the Statement of Significance does attribute aesthetic values to the street facade and the building's pyramid roofs that atop the towers, that are typical of a Federation Romanesque style building. So based on the aesthetic values listed in the Statement of Significance and applying the Borough Charter principles and practices, any new development that obscures the building's facades or roof planes when viewed from the street would adversely impact the identified aesthetic values of the place and would be considered as disrespectful and inappropriate development of the site. Conversely, any new development that maintains visibility from the street of the original building fabric that has been assessed as possessing aesthetic value, such as the facade and the pyramid roofs that atop the towers, can be assessed as recognising and respecting the identified aesthetic values of the place. So, in answering the question of what is a respectful distance in relation to the Stella Maris building, by applying recognised heritage principles that proposed development located behind the original ridgeline can be shown to be respectful and protect the recognised aesthetic values of the place. There's been a lot of debate and comment this evening about stepped or graduated scaling of buildings in relation to heritage buildings. The proposed development located behind the Stella Maris building is partially visible from the street, as my colleague Bill and Clayton mentioned earlier. And I guess the pub test would be, would the average man in the street perceive a more respectful design outcome if the proposed new building was moved further back from the rear of the Stella Maris building than is currently proposed? I believe the answer is no. So, in light of the proposed retaining and respecting of the heritage values of the Stella Maris building, we request Council adopt the Planning Officer's recommendation for approval with conditions rather than to adopt the alternative recommendation. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you. Any questions? Next speaker is Maurice Laven.
Hello, councillors. I just want to start by saying this is actually quite an emotional project for us. We've been involved with St Pat's for a very long time and we've watched the way they operate. It's an incredible operation to watch and we will do everything we can to make sure that there's the appropriate accommodation. The proposal is the result of constructive and detailed consultation that began several years ago with their staff and with their community. As previously mentioned, we commenced early consultation with the city's officers and subsequently with the Design Advisory Committee. The alternative recommendation contains subjective and demeaning comments, which we find a little bit offensive, such as crude, overbearing, not respectful, fails to comply on a massive scale, etc. These are inappropriate in any report and imply basically that we're incompetent and with a lack of understanding of heritage and architectural context. We believe we have a record of involvement here in the city that demonstrates the opposite. It's important to let those who know us and may be influenced by this, who do not know us and may be influenced by this report's language, understand our background and contribution to the city. I pick up on Jenny Archibald's comment about the history of architecture here, and the very first project I was involved in was the 18 terrace house on Norfolk Road. That was the first affordable new housing group in Fremantle that century. We believe that we bring a great deal of integrity to our project approach, as well as a strong background in heritage restoration, adaptation and sustainability. These are skills our practice was built upon, and we've received awards in those areas. Many of these projects have been in Fremantle. Early iterations of our office established a team to save and restore the then derelict, adjacent 18 to 24 Queen Victoria Street terraces. In fact, we lived in one of them for 20 years. And we ran an office out of it for 20 years. We've been involved in their maintenance and adaptation ever since. We've lived there and we love the buildings. We're also involved in the debate that saved the adjoining coal stores from demolition, a decision that led to their subsequent adaptation as apartments. We live and breathe our city. We've been known to reject projects that we don't believe are in its best interests. We believe we've contributed to the quality of the city. For example, Mediterranean Shipping Company, which is now seen as an iconic building in terms of restoration and heritage infill despite the opposition by some councillors at the time. Rialto on High, initially rejected by the city as a precast facade, a non-traditional construction technology for the West End, which was subsequently awarded a heritage, subsequently received a heritage award from the city. St Pat's Primary School successfully reactivated its site of Ellen Street, and most recently the old courthouse. which significant heritage restoration and reactivation of what was previously a dead part of the city centre. Finally, I ask you to consider putting some trust in us with this project, which is so critically important in addressing a huge social need. We love our city. We would never venture into a project that we didn't believe would add to its quality, and nor would we do anything that would affect the rest of that precinct. Thank you.
Questions of the speaker? And what I believe the final speaker in favour is Jaron, is it? Jaron Green?
Good evening, councillors. Thank you for your time. My name is Jaron Green. I was a resident at St. Pat's Ignatius House at 12 Queen Victoria Street for 3 years between 2017 and 2020. After a marriage breakdown in 2015, followed by work redundancy, I suffered a stroke related to stress in 2017 and found myself homeless. This was not my first time being homeless. After a family breakdown in my late teens, I was a busker in the streets of the city of Perth around the year 2000. I went back to school around that time. A good friend of mine committed suicide. I ended up working in hospitality, started a family, which eventually fell apart in 2015, like I mentioned earlier. As a result of having nowhere to go for a second time in my life, I could say I'm resourceful. I called a housing crisis line called Entry Point, which helped me obtain an interview with St. Patrick's. The room I had one window facing a wall and was in the corner of a building. It was a single room with a bathroom, a toilet, a shower. I kept my head down as I left or entered the building. I didn't want to associate with any of the people there. I was embarrassed to be there. 20 years of my life pretending to myself I was not part of that world, and here I was back in it. I started to work on myself, wondering how I got there. I entered the mental health plan and began seeing a clinical psychologist. I also started to notice the goings-on around me. The meals, the other men at my residence, the support workers at St. Pat's, their struggles, their lives. I started to realise I was not as isolated as I thought, that these were humans dealing with their own trauma or family histories or historical generational trauma. I was invited to take on the role, what St. Pat's calls a head lodger, responsible for cleaning some of the rooms, the shared accommodation, like the shared kitchen spaces when guys move out. I was more involved with the housing department and other residents. This responsibility, as well as working through some mental issues I was facing psychologically, have been a key to a complete transformation in myself and soul. What Dr. Carl Jung would call the process of individuation. I now reside with my beautiful fiancée and our gorgeous daughter, and we are now discussing the purchase of our own home. I am active in my community and have a secure and meaningful job where I'm well liked. I truly feel that without St. Pat's, I would have none of this. I've seen and lived with the other men who would be completely lost, most likely on the street or even dead. The truth is, I realise all of us are only a bad day and a couple of paychecks away from falling into the same trappings I found myself in. That there was a level of support still lacking at Iggy's that could be far better, yet for all its failings at the time, was the precise right amount of help I needed to get my life back. We need to replicate that, enhance it, and make it bigger. I think there's too much stigma and stereotyping of the type of people that benefit from the support of places like St. Pat's. I may have only needed a place to land while I figured things out, but many others need sanctuary, a place they can find solidarity. This project ushers in the chance to increase not only the quality of help, but the capacity, a space of dignity, healthy living with better lighting and homely space, a place where the homeless can call home. This project would be a gargantuan step forward in helping those members in our community who are at the most disadvantaged and reteach them the meaning of words like pride and hope. I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions? Thank you. I imagine this item is going to take a little time, so just to make sure we can give it due consideration, I'd like to propose a 5-minute adjournment. Is there any objection to that? Do I need to take a vote on that? No. So we'll just adjourn for 5 minutes, just a very brief break. So having checked the standing orders, we do need a motion to adjourn the meeting, so we'll apologise for that. So I'll move a 5-minute adjournment retrospectively. That's seconded by Councillor Graham. All those in favour? That's carried. And I'll just wait for Councillor Lawler and reopen the meeting at 7:55. Okay, well, thank you for all that comment. I will move the officer's recommendation, which is for approval. Is there a seconder? Councillor Graham. And the item we're voting on is on page 70, that the council supports the officer's recommendation. Anybody wish to speak?
Thank you. As everyone knows, I have an alternative motion. I won't move it now because I think it's appropriate to hear what my colleagues might have to say first in terms of the officer's recommendation. And I said this to the applicants, it absolutely gave me no pleasure at all to write an alternative recommendation. Everybody, I am sure, in this room, and I haven't heard a single word said against it, supports the land use for this site and the purpose of St. Pat's. And people know that I've actively supported that in the past. But our job in this room is the planning decision that needs to be made. And so it was my assessment. I mean, I looked at the proposal and read all the reports from different members of staff and the Design Advisory Committee and our heritage officers and the like. And I would say that I got to the position where, for me, it's not on the same level of concern as the Henderson Street development, but there was still sufficient and significant concern for me to warrant what I've put forward. I acknowledge fully that the development next door that hasn't been built yet has some challenging elements about it, and everybody that was in the JDAP meeting knows how hard I fought for modifications to that building so that it would stagger in a way away from the Stella Maris building in what I would describe as a more respectful way, and what I would describe as in a compliant way in terms of what is already written into our scheme with regard to that area. It's not yet built, and so I can't fully take that into consideration. I want to, firstly, I will happily change my recommendation if it gets to it. Even it might not get seconded. We might not even get to it. Words are, as Councillor Groom knows, words are not necessarily my best forte. And in reading what Design Advisory Committee and the like, the way they articulate it, my use of words of crude configuration probably should have been more along the lines, I'll get to find it again. The Design Advisory Committee talk about harshness or unsympathetic or the like. So, and I'll get to those words later. So I would have been quite happy to amend it if it's considered to be offensive in that sense. The issue of overbearing for me, I went through the application. I actually looked at a number of concerns, and I know that Councillor Groom did as well. I heard those concerns on site when we were there. And they generally were along the lines of the presentation of the very blank walls in both directions, the stepping nature of the building in terms of how that form appears in the street environment, some of the concerns about sun penetration into the common areas of the building and the like. And in reviewing all of those concerns, I got to the point that the majority of those I felt that I could let go and live with, and that they weren't at the level of concern that would warrant necessarily, I guess, a refusal or a deferral. And I focus then purely on the issue of what this does in the streetscape environment and what this does in terms of the conservation of the Stella Maris building. The concerns are not just about height. I haven't said anywhere that the height of the building in the middle of the site is unacceptable. For me, it's like the comment that I made about the Henderson Street proposal. It's that it's the location of height and its relationship to the street and the heritage that is concerning. But it's not just that alone. Height alone, and I've had this conversation with the applicant, height alone is not the only element. If you do a building that is close to another building but doesn't strongly compete with it, that in a sense is almost kind of invisible in the streetscape, then the height issue is lessened. It's a lesser concern. And I think, for example, if you know the building above the old Fremantle Workers Club, and its very simple facade treatment, it's a building that sits right on top of a single-story facade, but the way it was articulated and developed paid respect and left as the dominant piece of architecture the single-story facade. So it is quite possible to do a bigger building that is in the zone of a smaller building, a smaller heritage building, and get it in a way that it's not competing. It can sit there sympathetically. In my view, this version, unfortunately, by the nature of the blank wall and the nature of the banding and the nature of the shape of it, is quite unsympathetic to what is a very ornate Stella Maris building in the foreground. But they're not just my views. The DAC actually said that the proposed banding to the blank wall serves only to emphasise its scale, its visual dominance, and its invasive presence. So the DAC has said to the applicant much earlier in the process that it had those same concerns. The DAC also said that there remains limited physical separation between the existing Stella Maris building and the proposed addition with the upper floor cantilevering unsympathetically over the heritage building. While they did suggest a way of treating that, but that was just one way that you could have treated it. So the notion that they were suggesting was, we'll put some windows in, make it more animated towards the street. That was a suggestion, but the concern was very clear that it was unsympathetic and, in my word, overbearing. It also said that the step form is creating challenges with the built environment, but they also noted that, having raised those concerns, that the response was that the applicant is not prepared to change them, and that is something that has come forward a number of times. So the process that we have, which is trying to encourage people to change something, failed in that sense. The DAC made those suggestions. They made the suggestions that perhaps they should look at the step form, perhaps they should look at windows to the east, perhaps they should look at undoing the banding. So those were the things that the DAC suggested. I could suggest other things as well. It's not necessarily my place now that we're in a decision-making process. But they could have equally spoken to the cantilevering of the mass. They also talked about, in their report, perhaps it could be a building that turns the corner more, so that the building that, where it's where the balconies are, doesn't just end in a fairly blank wall facing the street. And they also talked about it perhaps could be a simpler, more subtle, contemporary form and materiality. So the DAC made those strong concerns known, and they haven't been dealt with. The heritage advice, and I'm talking about our internal heritage advice, is fairly similar in terms of the comments that were made. And I can quote from that. The cantilevering of the upper third, fourth, and fifth floors over the roof of the Stella Maris building is a poor heritage outcome as it reduces the amenity of the Stella Maris building as well as the visual legibility of this building and increases its dominance on the Queen Victoria Street streetscape, the dominance of the new build. It also, the Heritage Report describes the cantilever as having a significant detrimental impact. So it's not just, my words. These are the comments coming from the two expert panels, if you like, that are advising us. They also said that removing units that cantilever over the building could produce a better heritage outcome for the site. And again, the applicant decided that the Heritage Officer's comments were not valid and chose to continue with the application as it is. I would also argue, and I've seen, we've got perspectives and we've got the new drawing that was supplied in the email. This isn't about not seeing a bigger building behind the Stella Maris building for me. This is about either refining the architecture so that it isn't as dominant and that the building in the front is respectfully dealt with, or shifting it far enough back that the very dominant style of the architecture is sufficiently and respectfully set back so that can happen. So it's one or the other, or a combination of both. It's either refine the way the building impacts directly sitting over the top of the roof of the Stella Maris building, so that it effectively feels like it's not there as much as a dominant building might be, or setting it further back. And that is why, in my view, we need to ask the applicant to consider those elements that the heritage staff and the DAC have already asked them to consider. I fully acknowledge they started with 30 units. They wanted 30. They've got 28. I can see how hard the architects have worked to get that number in there. And in my alternative recommendation, I have indicated that perhaps instead of tearing down the building that sits on the southern boundary, they utilise the 3 stories that are already there, that the applicants next door basically assume would always be there and have already designed their building around, and utilise that to at least make the reduction in the number of units just 1 rather than 3. So it's not like I don't care. It's, I'm suggesting an alternative. The commentary about that is that, of course, that makes the public realm, or the common spaces, if you like, at the entrance to the building and at the first floor level where there is common space, dark and gloomy. Well, I've got to tell you, they're already dark and gloomy as proposed, and they are overshadowed by the location of the stairs and the lift and all of the access balconies that get to each of these units. So the compensatory comment to that is, of course, that this development has an amazing roof garden on the top, which is where the sun will be. And in a sense, it has a summer space down below, nice and cool and dark, and just like a typical Italian environment where you have deep shade. And then in winter, when you want the sun, you go up onto the top. It is possible to do it. It might not be the preferred, but it would certainly protect the heritage of the building a lot more from my view. In summary, it absolutely gives me no pleasure to put this forward. Other councillors urged me to put it forward, and perhaps didn't want to do it themselves, and I fully understand why. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So just we're still debating the officer's recommendation, and an amendment has been foreshadowed. Councillor Lorber.
Yeah, just a quick question. We're dealing with, and forgive me for being the new guy and asking all these questions. We're dealing with two separate sites owned by two separate entities. I'm just wondering, is there a way that we can consider these two applications separately? Because when we were on site, there, you can't actually. Well, we were told that you can't actually consider the Beach Street site for any design solutions because it's owned by a different entity, but lumping it in together with the site up above seems to be like, to me, like something that maybe we might want to vote on separately. I don't know. Just
to clarify, according to the city's records, both sites are owned by the same owner. They are different lots on different certificates of title. I'm not sure if St Pat's can clarify that, but from what we've just checked, that is our understanding. The difficulty is probably for the applicant, and it might be a question for them as to how the operation will work, because all the office space is on the Stella Maris side of the building. So all of a sudden you'll have a day centre that they'll have to make some design changes for to try and fit office space in. So I don't think it's as simple as saying approve the day centre side but not the other side. If it was, I'd suggest yes, and it would be two separate applications, but I think the intent is that it all operates as one facility.
it was just when we did our site visit, it was just explained to us the challenges of alternate design considerations were restrained because it was two separate owners. So just wondering if that might actually help the applicant in reconsidering. I don't know.
Without having been party to the conversation, I can't really comment on that. The only thing I can assume is that perhaps design changes are difficult because there is a lot boundary in between, and things like fire rating and the design's been quite deliberate in trying to design through that. The level changes are obviously quite a drastic feature as well. I'm not sure the ownership would come into it, but again, I wasn't on site, so I can't comment on exactly what was said.
Well, I mean, my view, and I'm loath to get into discussion with the representatives, but my view would be it wouldn't be helpful at all to separate them because you couldn't do one without the other. I mean, I'm getting nods from the people. Councillor Graham.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Still got this throat. Yes, well, on Monday was the first time I've actually ever been into the Stella Maris Club, and I was certainly blown away by what the services they provide, and that was backed up by Jared. So it was lovely to hear that story tonight. I mean, this is mostly one institution in Fremantle that provides what federal government, state governments, everyone's been talking about. What are we doing about homelessness in society? Well, I got a first-hand view of it on Monday evening, and I certainly was most impressed. And I thank them for that lovely site visit, which got me thinking, because the problem with this whole application, in many respects, is actually the Stella Maris building itself. It's heritage listed, I know, but if we were to put our community soul hat on and think about this site in a new way and support what St Pat's do and try to get more units into this project, not have such a height limit, not have a blank wall on the Queen Victoria Street, we would demolish this building. Because as soon as I walked through the door, there was no sign of any heritage features at all. All we've got is a blank facade of nothingness behind it, apart from small rooms, tight, places where people have to meet and discuss, personal and private things. It's if it could be brokered, and I know it's fanciful because it'll never happen, and Fremantle wouldn't be game enough to make that bold move to demolish this building. But if we were serious about the homelessness and everything that goes with it. This is one site that perhaps we you know, you read what the building was. Okay, it was a private residence in 1880. Well, does that make it a fantastic heritage site? I mean, it's pretty daggy looking at from the outside. I mean, it's in an area now where there is no great, you know, you get the Proclamation Tree on the corner there, and the heritage diminishes down the street. You've got the terraced houses are more of heritage value than the actual building that we're talking about next door. And as you go out Queen Victoria Street, of course, it lessens until you perhaps get over to North Fremantle. But anyway, that was the thought I had after having the site visit on Monday and reading all the paperwork and mulling it over the last few days. But of course, we've got this application in front of us. There's been lots of talk on height limits again, and you know, the reality, you've got to live in the real world. The reality is, right opposite this, there is height. The Live Apartments, 150 metres down the road, is height. The Heirloom Buildings is height. The approved plans next door, June 2021, is even higher in height. So there's no height argument here to be had, in my view. And in actual fact, there's very little argument at all to be had in this application. We've heard that the not the overshadowing, the overlooking, the R code satisfies that. So I think the officers have got this one right. The blank wall, as I said, the blank wall is a byproduct of the existing building. Hopefully they will do some treatment with that in the future, and they gave that commitment on Monday. So I'm fully supportive of this, not only from a social point of view, there's no doubt about that, obviously, but from a planning point of view, and I hope fellow councillors feel the same way.
Yeah, thanks for that. And like my fellow councillors, I'm really grateful to St Pat's for showing us around the site on Monday. It's eye-opening in many levels. One was exactly how much goes on in an extraordinarily small site, very, very efficient use. But also I think you really can't capture how grim those rooms are. They're tiny, they have low ceilings. If you've got a window onto a brick wall, I think you're lucky, you know, in terms of what those rooms are like. And so it's really clear that something has to happen on this site. I think the scheme that's been produced in terms of the amenity of the units is extraordinary, and there's clearly been a lot of focus on that. So I think the question is, have we got the built form right? And what always interests me about height is not height itself, but its impact on the built environment. So how is it impacting on the sites around it, and how is it impacting on the streetscape? And on the whole, I've satisfied myself on that, except that one of the neighbours made me think a bit harder about the report we've received and the conclusion that report reached about the overlooking. And I quickly opened a version of the Residential Design Code Volume 3, and our officers have actually made an error in their report. So the required setback for all levels above 4 is 9 metres from the site boundary. That is a deemed to comply criteria, so then we had to look at what other performance objectives for that site. And the intention of the setback is about the residential amenity that is being created and the impacts on neighbours. If we were to go forward with this, then I would move another condition about making sure that those balcony edge conditions were agreed with council before it was approved. And I suspect we might need to ensure that the balcony wall material was solid, and maybe even that the balcony heights need to be a little bit higher so that a seated person isn't looking into the gardens and so forth. I can see the architect in the back row nodding. So I would be very keen that, I guess, regardless, that we do amend the RAA report to include that condition. So if JDAP were so minded to approve it, we could take that condition forward, and I think the proponent would agree to that condition.
Yeah. So I'm really appreciative of the work that St. Pat's does, and being there on Monday was an eye opener for myself as well. A lot of good work happens in that building, as small and cramped as it is, and I think having a little bit extra room to stretch out will only increase the good work that can be done. Um, I guess again, I just am struggling with some people that are asking us to trust them, and that they said that they've done everything they can for this site, but they've done everything they can except for take some recommendations from the DAC on that blank wall that's on Queen Vic Street. And I just, I look at that and I think about the building next to it that was approved a while ago, and I think about this little house in Seattle called the Seattle Up House. You can Google that if you want, but it's a development that got built around this house, and it was just wall to wall and a house. And I feel that's what's going to happen to the Stella Maris building, is it'll just be walls all around it. And I would really like to either have more detail about how they're going to treat that wall, and how it's going to not be an imposing feature on that street in relation to everything around it, or B, see something that's a little more, in the DAC's term, sympathetic, I guess was one of the words. The other thing is also with the landscaping. It's called ambitious, and so again, that's another area that we're being asked to trust these folks to do a high quality and to get it right. And while I'm not necessarily opposed to that, I would just, we did get 5 pages of landscaping details, but we didn't get a single one for that wall facing the Queen Vic Street. So I think that if that little bit of extra detail was included, I would feel a lot better about supporting the officer's recommendation, and just to know what we were going to wind up with when it was finally built. So as of right now, I'm still kind of on the edge. I haven't decided one way or the other, and look forward to hearing other councillors' comments.
Councillor Lang.
Thanks. So this is not really a strength of mine, but all the arguments coming to here from designers and architects. But what I can see is this is certainly a really difficult site. For one, which all sites are in Fremantle, with constrained, we've got heritage either side. And the other element I'm considering here is that I'm assuming that St. Pat's are working to a budget. So we've got a constrained site under a budget, and then all of a sudden we've got 50 architects saying it's not brilliant, which is what I'm struggling with in this design. Then there's the arguments around the cantilevered buildings and so on, and I'm aware we've approved similar buildings. Henry Street in the West End, for example, we've got a modern building which is built directly over a heritage ruin. So we've approved these kind of things before, and I touched on it, that architecture and design is not my strength, but it does look kind of cool, the cantilever element, and it's also giving more room. So when we've got a difficult site, working to a budget, trying to accommodate as many vulnerable people as possible, it seems to me like it's a good practical outcome. And onto the blank facade that keeps being discussed, I'm looking here at the design. That the blank facade is only visible if you're on the far opposite side of the street looking up. If you're out the front of Stella Maris, you're not going to see the blank facade. The piece that you will see from across the street, if you look up, is only the top 2 floors, and it's going to be remediated with artwork. So potentially I can live with that. I don't think the blank facade is as bad as it's being made out. Some of the drawings, you're looking directly at Stella Maris, you can see the whole elevation, but that physically isn't possible unless you're standing back on Quarry Street, which is impossible. So I'm taking that into consideration as well. What is trying to be achieved here, I think, and we definitely all agree, is brilliant. I won't go into detail of it, but one thing I did like about it was the Beach Street hub, is that anyone in Fremantle can go in there if they want and get a haircut or have a coffee. Like, we could all go there and have a coffee or a meeting. And it's also a space where residents of St. Pat's, if they choose to, can also go and congregate and meet. And it's this integration that's helping to bring down stigma of people that may be staying at St. Pat's, that we're all working and we're all living in the same community. I think it's a really healthy, healing space. So supporting that and acknowledging that constrained site to a budget to achieve a good outcome, I'm in favour of the officer's recommendation.
Any further comments? I'll just make one comment while waiting. I think there's a lot of discussion of a blank facade. I think there is no suggestion it's going to be a blank facade when it's finished. It's just very unfortunate it's covered in artwork and we don't know what that artwork is. And I can't imagine what it might be. And if the artwork was part of the plan, it might help people move along. I don't know, I could imagine a giant crayfish crawling off the roof of the existing building onto the roof of the new building or something like that, but that would change it quite significantly. If it was a reproduction of the high street walls, probably not. So, you know, there's a lot of resting on that blank facade. So I'll just ask again if there's any more comments. Officer's recommendation is moved and seconded. Everybody ready to vote? You've moved the amendment. The 22 part, just that part. Yes. Okay, sorry. And you're moving that? And is there a seconder for that? Councillor Graham, all those in favour? That's carried. So the officer's recommendation is now amended to include that clause. So with that amended officer's recommendation, is there any further discussion? Okay, so all those in favour of the officer's recommendation? All those against? That's Councillor Sullivan against, that's carried. Thank you for your time. It's a rather lengthy process, but we got somewhere in the end. I just raised the question. I mean, it did occur to me why we're imposing 1% for art on a charity, but I'll just leave that there for discussion. And if that's mandatory or if there's some discretion for the council, but I'll just leave that there. Thank you for your time. We'll just pause for a minute while we change the room. While we're doing that, I've got Robbie Lang. Did you want to speak on the Amherst Street and you arrived late? Do you want to speak for or against the recommendation? Against, thank you. Okay, there is someone else before you, so just wait a second. Yep. Do we have Mark Zavella online? Can you turn on your microphone and camera, Mark, if you're there? You fell asleep? Yeah, we'll just wait if something's happening. Mark Zavella? Yes, there you are. Okay, just a minute. We'll just, everybody ready to go? Okay, so item 3, getting through this very quickly, is the Amherst Street item. Mark Zavella wishes to speak against the officer's recommendation. You have 3 minutes, Mark. Thank you. We'll just check your microphone first. Check your microphones on. We can't hear you. Should be a muted microphone somewhere on your screen, on a microphone with a line through it. Unless the problem's at our end. Just pause for a minute. Mark, can you try again, please? Is it a problem for you if I take the others? Is it a problem if I take the other speaker first? Do you need to turn things around? I can take the other one first? Yeah. Mark, if you can hear me, we'll take the other speaker first. That'll give us a few minutes to try and sort out your problem. Robbie Lang, would you like to speak? You have 3 minutes. Thank you. Just check the microphone. I think it's on.
Hello.
Thank you.
How you going? This proposed development is it's a huge development. It's 56 townhouses basically, and it's part of the Knutsford Street precinct, which is also known as the Fremantle Industrial Arts Quarter. That area is bounded by Amherst, Stack, Montreal, and Blinco Street. It's the old industrial area that was held back by the extension of the Roe Highway. In that, it offered a huge opportunity for creative people to do all sorts of interesting things, you know, like with the old warehouses and stuff. And in the past 20 years, all sorts of interesting little businesses have popped up there. And it's got massive potential for the diversity of Fremantle. In this proposed development, my own workshop will get knocked down, but that's no huge issue. But also, Blazing Swan building will get knocked down as well, and that's a significant community use building. Those are only two examples of things that are happening within the Greater Fremantle Industrial Arts Quarter. In the past 3 or 4 years, we've probably got like maybe 6 or 7 different cafes and you know, all sorts of really interesting little businesses have popped up in that area. The significance for Fremantle is, you know, on a tourist, you know, and also like for the actual people of Fremantle, for the people of West Australia, the industrial arts quarter is an incredible opportunity. And as a playground for the people of Fremantle, the people of West Australia. And I think it's really important, and the council actually saw that early on, because they saw this area in their recommendations as being an artist precinct. I know that development is inevitable in this area because of the property values, but this particular development is just a housing development. Now, to keep the essence of the whole mixed use and artist precinct and commercial precinct, it's very, very important that we don't just put more housing in there, more sort of yuppie housing. Like the developers are probably missing a huge opportunity because they're only seeing it as a, you know, as a cut and slice job, you know. Whereas if they saw the potential of what's sitting on their doorstep, what they could do architecturally is, you know, so much more, and it would add so much more to their values of their buildings as well. So what I think the development isn't sympathetic to what's happening on their doorstep, and I think the developers don't really understand. I don't think they really understand Fremantle, to be honest. I just think the complete lack of commercial space being involved in the development is at the core of the problem. And we all give lip service. We all give lip service to the fact that, you know, artist spaces are disappearing in Frio, and this is a classic example of that actually happening. And also the opportunities for all sorts of creative businesses. You know, we need those spaces in Fremantle.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
I'm not opposed to development in principle, but it's just a, you know, appropriate development and development that incorporates mixed use. Okay.
Thank you. Now, I'll just make the comment while waiting for Mr. Vella. We're actually, I've never seen this before, 25 submissions by members of the public against this development, and none of them live adjacent. None of them have a direct personal impact. I think that's quite remarkable. And none in favour. So that's in the consultation report. 25 against and none in favour, and none of the ones against are directly personally impacted. So I think that says a lot about how the community feels about this particular site and the precinct plan. Mr. Zavella, can we try again?
Hi there, can you hear me now?
Oh, that's much better. Thank you. 3 minutes.
Okay, apologies for the delay. Okay, good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank City of Fremantle for allowing me to speak remotely despite the technical issues that we've just had before. Unfortunately, I've got COVID, so it's probably best if I don't come to you guys. I also acknowledge it's already been a very long night with many high-profile applications under consideration, so I'll do my best to keep things as quick as possible. My name is Mark Savella, and I'm a resident of Hope Street in Wycombe Valley. I'm speaking against the recommendation to approve the proposed dwellings on Amherst and Stack Street, also known as Monument East. As a bit of background, I'm a registered practicing architect. I'm also a director in a family-run property development firm, so please do not hold that against me. I'd like to start off by saying that I genuinely believe in medium-density housing and the need for urban infill projects. However, you cannot support the proposal in front of you tonight, and I struggle to see how the City of Fremantle's planners and the Design Advisory Committee could have ever endorsed such a lazy scheme. In fact, reading through the RR report, I don't believe the DAC was even consulted with this project. Less than 1 kilometre from this site, we have half a dozen class-leading residential developments that have been highly awarded both in Western Australia and nationally. Projects like the Evermore Apartments, Terrace Green on Hope Street, Montreal Commons, the Nightingale Apartments, and the nationally acclaimed Knutsford development is no less than 250 metres away. The Knutsford East Structure Plan, adopted in 2017, sets clear development objectives and principles, and now 5 years on have proven to be successful for the residents, the community, and the developers involved. If we compare the proposed Monument East development to Knutsford, we can see a huge backward step occurring. The structure plan set out 14 well-considered and realistic principles, which Sue, I believe, is going to be talking to later in her alternative motion, which I would also like to just briefly cover now. The integration and permeability of the site, I believe, is flawed and prevents the integration to the surrounding area and offers no through-site access for pedestrians other than the residents themselves. In fact, the amended DA shows the scheme as a fully secured gated development. Green links and amenity. Monument East only offers a tokenistic pocket park to a portion of the verge on Amherst Street. To consider this as a green space is laughable, and it's essentially tarting up a portion of street verge, the bit that doesn't have 10 additional crossovers on it. Identity. The aesthetics can be best described as a copy-paste approach that resembles low-grade project homes. It does nothing to instill a Fremantle identity, nor does it establish a relationship with the area's history and industrial character. As an economic development, this is strictly residential only, and whilst that is permitted, I believe is a great missed opportunity to provide at least a small amount for local businesses that once thrived on this very site, like the popular V Bentoya restaurant. In regards to urban design, the ground level street activation is basically non-existent as it's dominated by garages and crossovers. The internal roads are convoluted and there are no meaningful breaks in the built form. The WAPC's Livable Neighbourhoods approach and Design WA's suite of documents have all been ignored here. Adaptability. Due to the dwelling's small floor plates and with most being over 2 to 3 levels, it means it's not possible to cater for more diverse groups such as the elderly or disabled. Personally, as someone who has considerable experience designing for aged care and NDIS accommodation, the justification to this comment raised in the RAR report is pretty pathetic. These are not adaptable dwellings and will not meet the changing needs of the community into the future. Finally, on sustainability, this scheme is purely designed around the economic principles of delivering the highest possible return whilst offering little to no community or environmental initiatives at all. What we can see from all of the nearby built projects that I've mentioned tonight is that it's not hard to achieve good design whilst creating a development that is viable and profitable for the proponents. If this scheme is approved, it'll undo all of the great work done thus far and set a dangerously low precedent for all future residential developments in Fremantle and the area. Which is why I urge all of the elected members sitting here tonight to refuse this application. We deserve better, and we don't have to look far to see where it has been done right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Just remind you that you are allowed to. You are allowed to present at the JDAP meeting if you're out of isolation. So keep in touch with the planners about how you can do that. And thank you for your contribution. Any questions? Might be difficult to ask questions, but are there any? No. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you. Is there anybody else here wishing to speak? Okay. I will move the officer's recommendation, which is to approve, and the council comment is on page 110. Is there a seconder? Do we need to second it before we can amend it? Not sure with an RAR. I think we may need to second it before we can actually. So Councillor Grimm has seconded it. This is a new process for us, so we'll get used to it. And you had, Councillor Grimm, you had an amendment to move? Sorry. Seven?
I just wanted to get some clarity. Don't know if that's on actually. Try again. Just want to get some clarity about the difference between the subdivision application that's already been lodged and the DA for the buildings. The question really is, what happens if the West Australian Planning Commission simply endorse the subdivision? What's the process now, given all of the changes that we've seen in terms of the medium density codes and those sort of things? Is it likely or possible that they would approve the subdivision without reference to what can be built on there?
It's probably a question for the Department of Planning, to be honest, but to our knowledge, they haven't determined this application yet, and I think they probably will wait and see what happens with this one. We are in communication with the Department of Planning on this, and tomorrow we'll probably touch base with them depending on what the outcome is tonight. In theory, yes, they could determine the subdivision at any stage. The applicant could walk away from the DAP process altogether and simply lodge a DA for each group dwelling on the site, and you'd have potentially a completely different outcome again. So it is, I guess, depending on who you speak to, a quirk of the planning system in that you can lodge these things concurrently. As to where the medium density codes are at in the chain of things, it seems to keep getting pushed out, but regardless, the current R codes do have a set of objectives in them, and there are deemed to comply requirements that deal with all sorts of things, as well as the structure plan. So there is a framework there that the Department of Planning needs to have consideration of when they are making their decision on the subdivision, same as with the built form outcome. It's just that the built form outcome in the DAP is far more detailed than a subdivision layout that just simply sets out lot, location and design.
So another question, if I may, Chair. The internal road designs, I'm just trying to get a bit of an understanding about those as well. They're classed as common property, as I understand. Does that mean that they're to be fully maintained by the collective owners of all of the individual lots? The other thing is there's not a lot of information about the tree planting and the like in those areas. There's not a lot of tree planting on any of the individual lots. I know that they say that each has got a deep root zone, a deep zone planting space, but I very much doubt whether someone with those courtyards is going to put a tree in any of them, or let alone maintain it if the tree goes in. So I'm wondering about what level of confidence one might have that, one, we can see a large number of trees planted, two, that they will be maintained for the life of the development. And the third one is in the narrow laneways, which presumably would preclude trees being planted because they're only just over 6 metres wide. Would it be possible to basically require alternative ways of creating canopy, i.e. through trellising and the like? Because you need a different approach. It might be vertical green walls, it might be trellising over the laneways at a suitable height to ensure that there is something else going on that creates canopy. Because I guess I want to know the answers to that in advance of the JDAP meeting, because for me at the moment, if the scheme was approved by JDAP, there's a lot that needs to be nailed down. So I'm trying to understand whether that's possible.
Through you, Chair. I guess the first question was about the common property driveways. Yes, they would be for the strata to maintain. The city wouldn't be responsible for maintaining those. There are conditions in the officer's recommendation that do require the lodgement of a detailed landscaping plan that does deal with those matters about the sizes of tree, location, species, all those kind of things. And in theory, JDAP or committee could add further detail about what the expectation is there to deal with those things. It is something that we as officers would like to see a really high quality outcome, because there is a lot of hard stand space in that common property, and we would like to see some improved landscaping through that area, which is why we haven't automatically accepted what the plan is as designed, and we would like to see some more in that space. Things like trellising, different locations for trees and things are definitely things that we would support as officers. The other thing to note as well is that the R codes now, even in their very simple form for single houses and group dwellings, do include provisions for trees per dwelling now. So part of that is making sure that there is a sufficient space for a tree to be planted and to survive.
Could I have one more question, Chair? It goes to the issue of commercial space and the units which are shown as adaptable particularly on Stack Street, and the issue of the power, the electricity wires that are over the top, and there's an easement across the site. Is the easement, does it preclude any form of development in terms of height and or land use? Is it, because I know a lot of those easements are often just about a height, that you can't go up too close to the wires. Is this one of those easements that is just, you can't build anything in this zone?
In terms of the specifics, I'd probably have to take that on notice, but my experience is that Western Power are very sensitive about what goes in those spaces, including things like trees. Once things are taken out, in my experience, depending on the voltage of the lines, of course, if a tree's there, trim it, but as soon as one gets taken out, they quite often push back on anyone planting or installing things, but we can check that detail and have a response ahead of the JDAP.
Oh, thank you. So we've moved and seconded the officer's recommendation. There is an amendment in the documentation. If anyone wishes to speak, Councillor Groom.
Yep, I would like to move an alternative recommendation that Council does not support the demolition of existing buildings and construction of the new group dwellings on the grounds that it's not consistent with the Knutsford East Local Structure Plan. So I was wondering
for a seconder, Councillor Lang. Okay. Do you wish to speak on that?
Yeah, I will talk to that. As I alluded to before, there's a lot of chatter in the development community on LinkedIn at the moment about how we should get rid of local governments from the planning system and leave it to the development industry, and this proposal shows me, well, that's just utter nonsense. So the Knutsford Street East Local Structure Plan was adopted in 2017. It was a process that went through extensive consultation with the community and with stakeholders, as Robbie has alluded to. Now, I'm cynical about those consultation exercises, or I used to be, but the depth and breadth of community response to this, the ownership of our community over the vision for Knutsford East has stunned me in the last few weeks, and it's come from all quarters. So people have really bought into the idea for Knutsford East, the idea that we would create this innovative housing in that area and this diverse uses. And people who aren't even skilled in reading plans and drawings have looked at this proposal and said, this is not the intention that we signed up for in this area. I think that's really powerful. I think it is about what's been delivered on the ground by, enabled by Development WA, but picked up and really run with by the private sector. And people like what they're seeing and they want more of it. And this proposal is not more of that. The other thing about this site is the structure plan area has several precincts, and this is 1/4 of the biggest precinct in that structure plan. And I calculate it's about 8% of the entire structure plan area. So we're not just talking about one little site that maybe we could get away with a few houses or not pay attention to the intent of the zone. It's a substantial part of the capacity and the outcome for the structure plan. So we need to hold it to account to that structure plan. So I think Mark's stolen a bit of my thunder, but I'll just quickly talk to a few of the things that really stood out for me. And probably the biggest one is diversity. So the structure plan was also always about a mix of use, a mix of activity, a mix of housing types. It envisaged that we would get affordability, we'd get units, we'd get large and small, we'd accommodate for a whole range of people in our community. This proposal is all 3 and 4 bedroom homes or houses. So there's no units, there's no diversity of use, there's no provision for accessible housing types, adaptability, or affordable housing. In some ways, it's actually an underdevelopment of the site, which is ironic. But the potential of the site to have 1 and 2 bedroom units, to have Fonzie flats or micro lots or a whole range of other housing types, to even have more height, is not realised in this proposal. A big thing about the structure plan was identity, so that the development of the site would instill a Fremantle identity. What's been put in front of us is the same rubbish that's being rolled out all across Perth. There's nothing about this built form that says Fremantle, and even more, there's nothing about this built form that says the Knutsford East area. I've also already talked to the economic development. It does displace existing activity, and I agree with Robbie, it's a great loss if we see Blazing Swan gone. But we always knew that was unfortunately the trade-off for development in this area. What concerns me more is that we don't alienate the other existing land uses, and the development butts onto a whole series of activities, including one of my favourite things, which is the wood shop on Wood Street. But there's no kind of reference in the proposal to how that interface is being managed to make sure we're not getting complaints from residents that then flow on to impacting those activities, which was the whole intent of the structure plan, was to make sure these activities could happen side by side and be sustained. Amenity, we've spoken to that, and certainly the complete lack of landscape, any feasible areas for deep planting, the crossovers on Amherst Street, the proposal that it's the pedestrians that should now go to the edge of Amherst Street instead of being able to enjoy the verge. The list goes on. Just quick go through. Innovation was one of the other objectives of the structure plan, and we certainly haven't seen any of that in this development. And finally, sustainability. It's the heart of what we're wanting to get out of our planning scheme, and the structure plan saw this precinct as a real place to push the boundaries of sustainability, show to the rest of Fremantle and the rest of Perth what was possible in housing development, and we're seeing that. So, we've got a battery going in with all the houses that are going to share that battery, all sorts of other kind of leading edge development. It's just around the corner from the Nightingale development, which is the first of its kind in Perth. And this project makes no attempt to do any of that. It's like barely minimum requirements for sustainability, hasn't grabbed any of those opportunities and precedents and even met them, let alone to see how it could go one better and kind of really give us some other example on this site. So I just can't find any way that we can honour our planning scheme, that we can honour the kind of contributions and commitment that our community have made to supporting that structure plan. And I feel if we were to support this, we're just really further eroding community confidence in the planning system and making a mockery of the very processes that we invest time and resources in as a council.
Thank you, and thank you for the work you put into that amendment. It's obviously a great deal of work, and I think there's a fair deal of support for that. Any further speakers on this item? Councillor Lorver.
I'm supporting Councillor Groom's amendment, and thank you for all the work you put into that. There's not really much to add to what's already been said, but you know, something like this. I mean, from I don't know, earlier this year, I spent a lot of time in Ellenbrook, and something like this would fit right in up there. You know, it's really, you know, really maximizing every square millimeter of the site for commercial sale. And I share all the things that Councillor Groom said earlier, that we hope to have more from these sites. I mean, this is Fremantle. We're not Ellenbrook. So hopefully we can get a better outcome for this. And yeah, I'll be supporting the alternate recommendation.
Off completely. Thank you. I would just like to say that I fully support all of the words that Councillor Groom has brought to this chamber. She put it extremely well, and I just think that so much good work has already happened in the precinct. It has set a precedent for what can be done. We do know that even better things can be done, and that's got to be the trend for that area. It's so close to the city. It's just such an amazing place where people could live, be able to walk to the city, walk to Boo Park. It's just, I've got a lot going for it. So I just think that what has been proposed has not looked at the area that it's sitting in. It hasn't taken account of how the people who live there could actually interact with their own environment that they're going to live in. And so I just, well, I think I've just said what I was going to say, but so I just urge everybody to support Councillor Groom's alternate motion, because I just think we need to ask for something better on this particular site.
Thank you. Any further contributions? Do you want to close the debate, Councillor Groom? Or I think you've said enough. Okay, all those in favour of the amendment? That's unanimous. Thank you. Now we've got the item 4, the information report. Are there any questions on that?
Yeah, just through you, Mr. Chair. I just want. I noticed that 90 Brack Street that has all been done and dusted. Could I?
Quick point of order: is that we now got an item as amended? Sorry. Oh, sorry. That was alternative. Okay. Sorry. We didn't move the item as amended for the previous item, so can we go back? Apologies for that.
So on 90.
Sorry. Okay, it's an alternative motion, so we're okay. Right. I will move the information report. Any seconder?
No, I'm speaking to it.
We can second it first.
Oh.
No, just second it, yeah, and then you can speak. Okay, Councillor Graham.
Look, it's just on the 90 Bracks one. Could I ask the officers to bring back to the next OCM the cost to the city that it has cost to defend the SAT appeal? That would include officers' time and cost, consultants' costs, heritage architects engaged costs, and any other related costs that the council incurred in that defence. Thank you.
I don't know. Does that need to be a formal motion, or is that a question to the staff?
Question to the staff.
You happy to do that? Yep. So the staff will take that on board. Thank you. Any other questions or comments on the information report? I note that the bar in South Terrace has withdrawn its appeal, not proceeded to the full bench. So all those in favour of the information report? Thank you. That's unanimous. The draft local planning strategy, we agreed, as it's been a long night, we'll just refer this straight to council. But there is an amendment by Councillor Lorver. Are we happy to leave that to go to council too, or it has been drafted in?
Well, if we can just get it in there, because it's more accurate to reflect the number of jobs. Can we put it in there now and then refer to council?
So I'm just questioning whether we want to move it now and amend the report before it goes to council. Happy to do that? Okay, so I'll move the.
Does it have to go to council?
Sorry?
Does this matter have to go to council? So that decision hasn't been made whether it goes to council. So let's have the amendment and then vote on it and then decide whether it needs to go to council.
I thought it did. Sorry, no, doesn't. Okay, okay. So I'll move the draft local planning strategy item 5. Is there a seconder? Councillor Lorber. Councillor Lorber has tabled an amendment which is in your documents, which has been drafted in consultation with the staff. So we're reasonably happy with it. You're moving that. Seconder, Councillor Groom. All those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you. So all those in favour of the local planning strategy item? No further speaking? Okay, all those in favour? That's unanimous. Does anybody want to request it go to council? No? Okay. Have we finished? No. Councillor Lang. Oh, this bit fell off my agenda. It was so thick. The staples didn't go that far. So I've got something. Councillor Lang wishes to provide a notice of motion. So perhaps you'd like to move that and introduce it. I'll second it.
This one's very straightforward, and it came about after we approved development in North Fremantle.
Sorry, can you put your microphone on?
This one's very straightforward. It came about after we approved the development in North Fremantle 17 weeks ago, and I put a little blurb up on my Facebook page about what we approved, and a member of the community commented and said, do we really need more black steel boxes in this climate scenario? And it got me thinking about what we're doing in terms of approvals, in terms of black roofs and black structures, and seeing what else is occurring. On the East Coast, I noticed Sydney moved in a direction to bland back roofs, then backed out. I don't know why. And I started speaking with the staff, and they've helped draft up this motion, which is not on the screen at the moment. And since we actually were discussing with the staff, the planning team, Bayswater went ahead and moved the motion to ban black roofs, and we're fortunate enough to look at the policy they've put forward and lean on that a little bit in what we're looking at here. So this is merely an opportunity for us to look at ways in which we can prevent buildings, unsustainable buildings being built with black roofs.
Any further comments on this item? Yep, Councillor Graham.
Yeah, look, I'm intrigued by this, and I understand where Councillor Lang's coming from. But what concerns me with these things, and it's we've had a couple before, having been on here about 3 years now, but they're very few and far between. But it gives the opportunity for a density bonus, right? So that means somebody could put a 1-star rating or something, a minimum 3 kilowatt, 300 litre, and they can build another house on their block, couldn't they? I take it that's mostly what it means, a density bonus. Yeah, I know it does exist. Yeah. But what I'm saying is, so this all sounds well and good for the green environment, but if you get a density bonus to build another lot on your rear yard, well, then you've got to get the bobcat in to clear it. And there goes 2 huge trolleys of soil off the landfill. Then you've got the builder come in and he fills up 2 or 3 huge skip bins of building waste. That goes off to landfill. And, I just think it's a real feel-good thing, but it's a bit of an oxymoron in some respects, isn't it? I mean, it's a contradiction in terms to try and save a little bit, yet we're building bigger houses and sending more off to landfill and all the appliances we've got to buy and everything else that goes with it. I find it amusing. I'm going to support it, but I just think perhaps we should be aware of what we are actually doing in this world. Isn't most probably the right thing?
Any further comments on this item, Councillor Sullivan?
I fully understand where this is heading, and I've seen a lot of policies in place over many decades banning this material or that material, and a lot of it often it becomes generated from kind of like this urban myth that there's one way of doing things. Where we're at with the way buildings have to perform is they now have to go through a very rigorous assessment of what their ratings are. And if you choose to use a white roof, it will have a little bit of a tiny benefit, and you might be able to have a little bit less insulation in the roof. And if you choose to have a black roof, you will need to have a slightly, you might need to have a slightly greater amount of insulation in your roof or in your wall or the like. So the notion that it's the black roof that really needs to change, there's not a lot in it, frankly. And the reason community picks on the black roof is, one, it doesn't like it visually in a lot of instances, but two, it's representative of the sort of suburbia that we're seeing out there. So we're suddenly seeing all these houses out there, not in Fremantle, but all these houses out in suburbia with these dark grey roofs, and people pick on that part of it as being the symbolic thing that needs to change. Well, what needs to change is not the black roof, but the amount of open space that's left available for tree planting. What needs to change is the wastage of land that happens around these buildings, where you get the Ned Kelly effect of the house, which is a 1 metre or 1.5 metre strip around the edge and virtually nothing else, and your Super 6 fence goes to there, and your eave is there, and that's about it. Now, these houses are symbolic of that. They represent the same house, but people just pick on the black roof as being, because that's the bit you see from their aeroplane, and everyone goes, isn't that sort of development just bloody awful and unsustainable? Well, yes, it's bloody awful and unsustainable, but it's not because of the black roof. So if you're going to pick on something, pick on, there's a full list of things that need to be in the planning documents, and this is way down the bottom of the list. So I'm not going to support it because it's a question of priority.
Any for Councillor Lawler?
Oh, you just quickly. I have a house with a black roof, and I just covered it in black solar panels, and it works great. But I think if adopting something like this is very, very well intended, but in places like Hilton with a heritage policy, people struggle to change their roof into anything other than what's already there. I've heard stories of folks wanting to put a lighter colored tin roof and have been told not that they can. They have to put tiles back on. So I think this is very, very well intended. I mean, I'll support it to get the report, but I'm not certain that I would support the report until we actually see it. It's just getting a report so we can consider it, correct? Yeah. That's more work for you, staff. I'm sorry.
Any further discussion?
Well, I'm going to do the opposite. I think it's really well intended, but I'm not going to support it because there are so many other priorities in our planning on the list for our staff at the moment. I wish I could have Councillor Sullivan's faith that the energy rating system was actually meaningful and rigorous. But nevertheless, black roofs do attract an insulation penalty. I completely agree with you. I think our scope is so limited because so few people utilise the split density bonus. And I know how long the list is for planning staff. So can we bring it back in a year, Councillor Lang?
Any further discussion? Okay, Councillor Lang, would you like to close the debate?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I agree. There are loads of things, Councillor Sullivan, that we could do, and perhaps it's an opportunity for us to identify those in the report as well, and maybe add those in and make the appropriate changes. Otherwise, I feel as though if we're sitting here doing nothing, we're just allowing, if, for example, the development that we described in Whitegum Valley comes through, and you watch a whole bunch of townhouses go up with black roofs. Sure, it's just the tip of the iceberg, but it's an important change and it's a start. So do we do nothing, or can we get the report and then look at other opportunities, or can we make an amendment to this motion I've got to try and do something positive in terms of sustainable development?
I'm afraid you've closed the debate, so they can't. So we'll take a vote on this item. All those in favour? All those against? That's lost. Before I finish off the item, I just want the officers want to clarify something with the committee.
Just wanted to check that with the strategy item that you didn't want to send it to council because it present, it's moved to be sent to the Commission. So no workshops, nothing to the Commission to get permission to advertise.
Okay, so we're just double checking it's not going to council to reassure the officers. Thank you. Okay, so we've got urgent business, none, late items, none, confidential business, none. Close the meeting at 9:09. I'd just like to thank the committee and the staff. It's been one of the most technically complicated meetings we've had in a long time.